Welcome, young scholar, to the extraordinary tale of Hermione Jean Granger, the brightest witch of her age, whose brilliant mind and loyal heart helped save the wizarding world from its darkest hour. Tonight, we follow her journey from a curious Muggle-born girl discovering magic for the first time to becoming one of the most respected witches in magical history. As you settle into your cozy reading nook, let these words carry you through the life of someone who proved that knowledge, courage, and friendship are the most powerful magic of all. Close your eyes and drift into this chronicle of wisdom, bravery, and unwavering dedication to what is right. Welcome to the extraordinary tale of origins and discovery, where magic first touched the life of a remarkable girl who would grow to become the brightest witch of her age. In a quiet suburban neighborhood where manicured lawns met perfectly painted fences, where the greatest mysteries were usually solved by consulting encyclopedias rather than ancient tomes, there lived a family whose ordered world was about to be transformed by forces beyond their wildest imagination. The house at the end of Heathgate stood as a testament to middle-class respectability, its brick facade weathered by English rain but sturdy in its commitment to conventional excellence. Within its walls lived Mr. and Mrs. Granger, both dentists whose dedication to precision and care had earned them a comfortable practice and the respect of their community. They were logical people, believers in science and reason, who approached life's challenges with methodical thoroughness and unwavering faith in the power of education to solve any problem. But on a September morning, when autumn mist clung to garden gates and the first leaves whispered of coming change, their perfectly ordered existence welcomed an addition that would challenge every assumption they held about the nature of reality itself. Hermione Jean Granger entered the world with a cry that seemed almost indignant, as if she were already protesting the limitations that ordinary life might place upon her extraordinary potential. Her parents had chosen her name with characteristic thoughtfulness, drawing inspiration from Shakespeare's Winter's Tale, where Hermione was a queen of wisdom and strength who endured great trials with dignity and tact. They could not have known how prophetic their choice would prove, how perfectly the name would suit a girl destined to face darkness with courage and emerge victorious through the power of knowledge and unwavering moral conviction. The name itself was unusual enough to mark her as different from her peers, a distinction that would prove both blessing and burden in the years to come. From her earliest days, Hermione displayed the insatiable curiosity that would define her character throughout life. While other toddlers were content with simple toys and picture books, she gravitated toward anything that contained words, studying the shapes of letters with fascination that bordered on obsession. By age 3, she was reading with fluency that astounded her parents and concerned her pediatrician, who worried that such advanced development might indicate social or emotional difficulties that would require professional intervention. But Hermione was simply hungry for knowledge in ways that normal childhood couldn't satisfy. She devoured information with the same enthusiasm that other children reserved for sweets, absorbing facts and concepts with ease that made formal education seem almost redundant. Her parents, despite their initial concerns, soon recognized that their daughter's exceptional abilities were gifts to be nurtured rather than problems to be solved. The Granger household became a temple to learning, filled with books on every conceivable subject, educational toys that challenged rather than entertained, and conversations that treated Hermione as an intellectual equal despite her young age. Her parents discussed current events at dinner, explained scientific concepts during bedtime stories, and encouraged questions that would have tried the patience of less dedicated educators. They understood instinctively that conventional parenting approaches would be inadequate for a child whose mind worked on levels that exceeded their own understanding. Family expeditions reflected this commitment to education and enrichment. Regular camping trips to the Forest of Dean provided opportunities for hands-on learning about nature, conservation, and the delicate balance between human civilization and the wild spaces that existed beyond urban boundaries. Hermione learned to identify birds by their songs, plants by their leaves, and constellations by their positions in the night sky. These experiences grounded her love of learning in practical application, teaching her that knowledge was most valuable when it could be used to understand and interact with the world around her. Their frequent visits to London's theatre district opened another realm of learning, exposing Hermione to the power of language and performance in ways that textbooks could never convey. Sitting in darkened theatres watching Shakespeare's characters wrestle with moral dilemmas and eternal questions, she began to understand that knowledge wasn't just about accumulating facts, but about exploring the depths of human experience and the complexities of right and wrong that would define her later struggles against true evil. But even as her parents worked to provide comprehensive education and enriching experiences, they began to notice incidents that defied rational explanation. Objects moved when Hermione was upset, appearing in different locations without anyone having touched them. Lights flickered in response to her emotions, growing brighter when she was excited, and dimming when she was frustrated or sad. Books fell open to exactly the pages she needed for school projects, as if responding to her unspoken wishes for assistance. At first, these incidents were dismissed as coincidence or misperception, the kind of random events that seem significant only because people were naturally inclined to find patterns in chaos. Mr. and Mrs. Granger were scientists, trained to seek logical explanations for unusual phenomena, and they initially attributed the strange occurrences to faulty wiring, settling foundations, or simple imagination, enhanced by their daughter's precocious nature. But as the incidents became more frequent and more dramatic, denial became increasingly difficult to maintain. When Hermione's hair grew back overnight after an unfortunate encounter with scissors, when her broken arm healed with impossible speed after a playground accident, when she somehow appeared on the school roof during a particularly upsetting confrontation with bullies, her parents could no longer pretend that normal explanations would suffice. The revelation that their daughter possessed abilities beyond conventional understanding was both thrilling and terrifying for parents who had built their lives on scientific certainty and logical progression. Everything they thought they knew about the world, about the limits of human potential, about the boundary between possible and impossible, was suddenly called into question by the undeniable evidence that their child could affect reality through means that modern science couldn't explain or predict. Hermione herself was aware that she was different from other children, but she lacked the vocabulary to describe what was happening to her, or the framework to understand why her experiences didn't match those of her peers. She knew instinctively that discussing these incidents would only lead to disbelief, mockery, or worse. So she kept her growing awareness of her unusual abilities secret, adding another layer of isolation to an already solitary childhood spent among books and adult conversations. The loneliness was profound but not bitter, tempered by her genuine love of learning and her understanding that intellectual gifts often came with social costs that had to be accepted as part of their price. She found companionship in literature, comfort in the precision of mathematical concepts, and satisfaction in mastering new subjects with ease that made formal education feel almost effortless. Her room on the first floor of their house became her sanctuary, filled with books that covered every surface and provided refuge from a world that seemed designed for minds less hungry than her own. She read voraciously and without discrimination, consuming everything from children's fairy tales to advanced scientific texts with equal enthusiasm and remarkable comprehension. Her parents worried sometimes that she was too serious, too focused on academic achievement at the expense of normal childhood experiences, but they also recognized that forcing her to conform to conventional expectations would be cruel and ultimately futile. The magical incidents that punctuated her daily life gradually became more controlled and purposeful, as if her abilities were responding to her growing maturity and emotional stability. She learned to channel her unusual talents into helpful rather than disruptive manifestations, using them to enhance her learning rather than to frighten or amaze others. Books opened to relevant passages when she needed information. Complex homework problems solved themselves when she stared at them with sufficient concentration. Difficult concepts became clear through insights that seemed to come from beyond her conscious understanding. But control brought its own challenges. As Hermione began to realize that her abilities set her apart in ways that could never be completely bridged through normal social interaction. She was living in two worlds simultaneously: the rational, scientific reality that her parents had taught her to value, and another realm where thoughts could influence matter and will could reshape reality according to principles that existed beyond the reach of conventional education. The internal conflict between these two worldviews was resolved on a grey November morning when Professor McGonagall appeared at their front door, her tartan robes and pointed hat looking so perfectly right that Hermione wondered why she had never expected exactly such a visitor. The professor's explanation of the wizarding world, of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, of magic as a legitimate field of study with its own rules and traditions, provided the framework that Hermione had been unconsciously seeking throughout her unusual childhood. Her parents' reaction was a mixture of relief, wonder, and terror that reflected their deep love for their daughter and their recognition that her future would take her far beyond their ability to guide or protect. They listened with growing amazement as Professor McGonagall explained concepts that challenged everything they thought they knew about reality. But they also understood that this explanation finally made sense of their daughter's extraordinary abilities and provided her with the educational opportunities that her unique gifts required. The discussion that followed was both practical and profound, covering everything from the mechanics of magical education to the broader implications of discovering that an entire hidden society existed parallel to the mundane world they had always known. Professor McGonagall answered their questions with patience and thoroughness that reflected her years of experience in explaining the magical world to Muggle parents whose children had been selected for Hogwarts education. Hermione herself listened with fascination that bordered on euphoria, finally understanding that her unusual experiences weren't signs of mental illness or supernatural possession, but evidence of abilities that could be developed and refined through proper training. The prospect of attending a school dedicated to magical education, of studying subjects that aligned with her deepest interests and natural talents, filled her with anticipation that made the remaining months before September seem almost unbearably long. The visit to Diagon Alley was a revelation that exceeded even Hermione's considerable imagination, opening her eyes to a world where the impossible was routine and the extraordinary was merely Tuesday. Walking through the hidden entrance behind the leaky cauldron, she felt as if she were crossing the threshold between childhood and destiny, leaving behind the mundane limitations of Muggle existence to enter a realm where knowledge and wisdom were literally magical forces that could reshape reality. The shops that lined the cobblestone street offered wonders that made her previous understanding of the world seem quaint and limited. Ollivander's, with its narrow aisles packed with wand boxes that hummed with contained power, represented the perfect marriage of craftsmanship and magic that appealed to both her aesthetic sensibilities and her scientific curiosity about how magical objects functioned. The wand that chose her, vinewood with a dragon heartstring core, felt like an extension of herself from the moment she first held it, responding to her touch with warmth that seemed to recognize her potential. Flourish and Blots was paradise in book form, offering text on subjects that combined rigorous academic standards with content that transcended the boundaries of conventional education. She purchased not only the required textbooks but additional volumes that promised to expand her understanding of magical theory, history, and practice. The weight of the books in her arms felt like the physical manifestation of knowledge itself, tangible proof that learning could be both intellectually satisfying and practically useful in ways she had never imagined possible. The other shops provided additional glimpses into a society that had developed completely different approaches to problems that the Muggle world addressed through technology and scientific method. Apothecaries stocked ingredients for potions that could heal injuries, influence emotions, or transform the very nature of reality. Magical equipment served functions that Muggle engineering could only dream of achieving. Even simple household items were enhanced with enchantments that made them more efficient, more responsive, and more attuned to their users' needs and preferences. But beneath the wonder and excitement, Hermione also felt the weight of responsibility that came with discovering her magical heritage. She understood instinctively that power of any kind carried obligations to use it wisely, that knowledge without moral guidance could become dangerous, and that her unusual abilities would require careful cultivation if they were to serve good rather than selfish purposes. The months between her Diagon Alley visit and the start of term were spent in intensive preparation that reflected her characteristic approach to any new challenge. She read every assigned textbook multiple times, memorizing not just the facts but understanding the underlying principles that made magical practice possible. She attempted simple spells with remarkable success for someone without formal training, demonstrating natural aptitude that exceeded what even magical educators typically expected from incoming students. Her parents watched this preparation with mixture of pride and concern, understanding that their daughter was embarking on an educational journey that would take her far beyond their ability to help or advise. They could provide emotional support and practical assistance, but the magical world she was entering represented territory where their scientific training and logical worldview would be inadequate guides. The trunk that contained her school supplies became a symbol of transformation, packed with items that represented a complete departure from everything her previous education had required. Robes instead of uniforms, cauldrons instead of laboratory equipment, magical texts instead of conventional textbooks. Each item represented another step away from the Muggle world and toward the magical destiny that awaited her at Hogwarts. As September first approached, Hermione felt the mixture of excitement and nervousness that accompanies any major life transition, but amplified by the knowledge that she was about to enter a world where the very nature of reality operated according to principles she was only beginning to understand. The girl who had spent her childhood reading about fictional magic was about to discover that truth was far more extraordinary than any fantasy she had encountered in literature. The night before her departure, she stood at her bedroom window looking out at the ordinary suburban street where she had spent her childhood, understanding that she was seeing it with different eyes than the ones that had first observed these familiar sights. The streetlights that had once represented the height of human technological achievement now seemed quaint compared to magical illumination. The houses that had once defined the boundaries of her world now appeared as merely one small corner of a reality that extended far beyond anything she had previously imagined. But even as she prepared to leave the Muggle world behind, Hermione understood that her parents' love and the values they had instilled would remain essential parts of who she was becoming. Their dedication to helping others through their dental practice had taught her that knowledge was most valuable when used in service of those who needed assistance. Their commitment to logical thinking and evidence-based decision-making would serve her well in magical education that required careful observation and systematic understanding of complex phenomena. The girl who would board the Hogwarts Express the following morning carried with her not just magical abilities and academic preparation, but a foundation of moral conviction and intellectual curiosity that would guide her through challenges that her parents could never have anticipated. She was ready to discover what it truly meant to be a witch, to find her place in a community of magical learners, and to begin the transformation from exceptional muggle child to legendary magical practitioner. As dawn broke over the ordinary suburban street, Hermione Granger prepared to step through the barrier at platform 9 3/4 into a world where her extraordinary gifts would finally find their proper home. The brightest witch of her age was about to begin the education that would shape not only her own destiny, but the fate of the entire wizarding world. Welcome to the magical threshold of discovery, where a brilliant young girl stepped from the ordinary world into a realm of wonder that would test every assumption she held about friendship, bravery, and the true meaning of belonging. The scarlet steam engine that would carry her to Hogwarts represented more than mere transportation, but transformation itself. The bridge between childhood certainty and the magnificent uncertainty of magical education that awaited beyond the Scottish Highlands. Platform 9 3/4 bustled with controlled chaos that spoke of traditions maintained across centuries, families bidding farewell to children who would return, changed by experiences that Muggle relatives could never fully comprehend. The barrier between platforms 9 and 10 had seemed solid and impenetrable until the moment Hermione ran toward it with heart pounding and eyes closed, emerging into a hidden world that validated every impossible dream she had nurtured during her extraordinary childhood. The Hogwarts Express itself was a masterpiece of magical engineering, its crimson exterior gleaming with more than mere paint but enchantments that had kept it running safely for generations of students. Steam rose from its funnel in patterns that seemed almost sentient, swirling into shapes that suggested winged creatures before dispersing into the grey London morning. The whistle that announced departure carried notes that resonated in frequencies beyond normal human hearing, calling to something deep within the magical cores of those destined for Hogwarts education. Hermione found a compartment that she hoped would remain quiet enough for reading, settling herself by the window with one of her new textbooks opened across her lap. The countryside that rolled past represented the physical journey from her familiar suburban existence to the castle that would become her true home, but she understood that the real transformation was internal. A gradual adjustment from Muggle expectations to magical possibilities that would require every resource of intelligence and adaptability she possessed. The interruption came in the form of a round-faced boy with worried eyes and trembling hands, searching desperately for something that he had obviously lost and could not afford to lose. Neville Longbottom introduced himself with stammering politeness that revealed both good breeding and crushing anxiety, explaining that his toad Trevor had escaped and might be found anywhere on the train by now. His distress was so genuine that Hermione immediately abandoned her reading to help search, understanding instinctively that kindness to those who needed assistance was more important than any academic preparation. Their search led them through compartment after compartment, filled with students displaying various degrees of excitement, nervousness, and magical ability that ranged from impressive to alarming. She saw sweets that moved of their own accord, cards that showed moving pictures of famous witches and wizards, and casual displays of magic that were clearly routine for those raised in magical households, but remained miraculous to someone experiencing them for the first time. The compartment where they found Trevor also contained two boys whose conversation suggested they were already developing the kind of friendship that Hermione had observed from a distance but never experienced personally. Harry Potter and Ron Weasley were attempting magic with results that revealed both potential and the need for proper instruction, their easy camaraderie, highlighting her own isolation in ways that she tried not to acknowledge even to herself. Her demonstration of magic to fix Harry's broken glasses was intended as helpful contribution to their conversation, but she realized immediately that it had the opposite effect, marking her as someone who showed off rather than simply offering assistance. The reaction taught her first lesson about the complex social dynamics that would define her Hogwarts experience, that magical ability alone was insufficient for social acceptance, that intelligence without emotional awareness could alienate rather than impress, and that good intentions didn't automatically translate into positive relationships. The journey continued with mixture of anticipation and growing awareness that Hogwarts would present challenges that extended far beyond academic coursework. She had prepared extensively for magical education, but not for the intricacies of dormitory life, house loyalty, or the delicate balance between individual achievement and group harmony that seemed to define student culture at the world's most prestigious magical institution. The castle itself exceeded every expectation she had developed through reading Hogwarts. A history, its towers and turrets reaching towards stars that seemed closer and brighter than any she had observed from her bedroom window in suburban London. The Great Hall was vast beyond comprehension, its ceiling reflecting the night sky with accuracy that made indoor and outdoor seem like meaningless distinctions. 4 long tables filled with hundreds of students created an atmosphere of community and tradition that spoke of generations who had passed through these same doors, sat in these same seats, and been shaped by experiences that would soon become her own. The Sorting Hat's consideration of her placement became a moment of profound internal tension, as she felt the ancient magic probing her character and finding elements that aligned with multiple houses. Ravenclaw would have been the obvious choice, given her intellectual achievements and love of learning that had defined every aspect of her identity since earliest childhood. The prospect of spending 7 years among students who shared her academic passions held undeniable appeal for someone who had felt intellectually isolated throughout her Muggle education. But the Hat sensed something deeper than mere intelligence, qualities that would prove more fundamental to her character than even her exceptional magical abilities. Courage was present but untested, waiting for circumstances that would reveal whether her moral convictions were strong enough to support action when action carried personal risk. Loyalty existed in potential, ready to bloom into fierce devotion once she found people worthy of such commitment. Justice burned within her as fierce flame that could motivate extraordinary sacrifice when faced with genuine wrong that demanded correction. The decision for Gryffindor felt inevitable once the Hat began exploring these deeper aspects of her nature, recognizing that intellectual gifts were merely tools that derived their value from the purposes they served. She would need courage more than cleverness in the trials ahead, bravery more than brilliance when facing enemies whose power exceeded anything that academic achievement alone could overcome. The red and gold that surrounded her at the Gryffindor table represented not just house colors, but the qualities that would define her contributions to the magical world. Her early weeks at Hogwarts confirmed both the excitement and isolation she had anticipated, as academic excellence earned her professors' approval, while creating distance from classmates who found her intensity overwhelming and her eagerness to answer questions annoying. She threw herself into magical study with characteristic thoroughness, mastering spells and concepts with speed that impressed even experienced magical educators, but did little to endear her to peers who struggled with material that she found intuitive. The flying lessons that should have provided welcome relief from academic pressure instead highlighted her limitations in ways that were both humbling and frustrating. Her broom responded sluggishly to commands that other students executed effortlessly, rolling pathetically across the ground instead of rising into the air with the grace that magical transportation required. The failure was particularly galling because it represented her first encounter with magical ability that couldn't be mastered through reading and memorization alone, but required intuitive connection between wizard and enchanted object. Her strict adherence to school rules reflected both her respect for authority and her understanding that institutions like Hogwarts required structure to function effectively, but it also isolated her from students who viewed rule-breaking as normal part of adolescent development. When she overheard Harry and Ron planning to sneak out for Draco Malfoy's midnight duel, her intervention was motivated by genuine concern for their safety and the house points that their inevitable capture would cost Gryffindor, rather than desire to control or criticize their choices. The confrontation with the three-headed dog that they encountered in the Forbidden Corridor provided her first real glimpse of the dangers that lurked within Hogwarts itself, creatures and magical protections that existed far beyond the safe boundaries of classroom instruction. But while Harry and Ron focused on their narrow escape from Fluffy's massive jaws, Hermione's analytical mind immediately grasped the broader implications of what they had discovered, understanding that the dog was guarding something valuable enough to warrant such extreme protective measures. The research that followed demonstrated her unique value to any partnership, her ability to find obscure information and connect seemingly unrelated facts into coherent theories that explained phenomena that others could observe but not understand. The revelation that Nicholas Flamel was connected to the Philosopher's Stone provided the crucial insight that transformed their adventure from random rule-breaking into genuine investigation of threats that could affect the Philosopher's Stone, provided the crucial entire wizarding world. But academic achievement and investigative brilliance proved insufficient preparation for the social challenges that defined her daily existence at Hogwarts, particularly her relationships with classmates who found her corrections and superior knowledge irritating rather than helpful. The incident with the troll began with Ron's cruel assessment of her personality, comments that were meant to be private but struck at insecurities that she had carried throughout her solitary childhood, among peers who couldn't match her intellectual abilities. The bathroom where she retreated to cry represented more than physical space, but emotional territory, where she could process the painful reality that magical ability alone wouldn't guarantee the acceptance and friendship she had hoped to find at Hogwarts. The tears she shed were for the loneliness that had followed her from the Muggle world, for the recognition that being different might always mean being alone, and for the fear that even magical education might not provide the sense of belonging she had spent her entire life seeking. The troll's appearance in her refuge was cosmic irony that transformed her lowest emotional moment into the catalyst for the friendships that would define the rest of her life. The creature's massive bulk and primitive intelligence represented pure physical threat that couldn't be reasoned with or impressed by academic achievement, danger that required immediate action rather than careful analysis or proper preparation. Harry and Ron's arrival demonstrated courage that transcended their earlier dismissal of her personality and intelligence, their willingness to risk personal safety for someone they barely knew, revealing character depths that academic interaction alone could never have disclosed. The battle that followed was chaotic and terrifying, featuring magical improvisation under pressure that bore no resemblance to the carefully controlled spellcasting of classroom instruction. But the moment that truly cemented their friendship was her decision to lie to Professor McGonagall about the circumstances that had led to their confrontation with the troll. The fabrication she constructed on the spot was masterful in its simplicity and believability, taking responsibility for events that were actually beyond her control, while presenting Harry and Ron's actions in the most favorable possible light. The lie was her first significant rule violation, and her first demonstration that friendship might sometimes require choices that challenged her previous moral certainties. The transformation in her relationships was immediate and profound, As Harry and Ron accepted her into their circle, with warmth that validated every hope she had harbored about magical education, providing the friendships that Muggle school had never offered. Their dynamic was complementary in ways that enhanced all three participants, her analytical abilities balancing their intuitive courage, while their willingness to act provided practical application for her theoretical knowledge. The academic assistance she provided was offered freely and without condescension, sharing knowledge in ways that helped her friends improve their performance while reinforcing her own understanding through teaching and explanation. She learned to moderate her classroom behavior, to avoid overshadowing classmates unnecessarily while still maintaining the academic excellence that was integral to her identity and essential for her future magical career. The Quidditch incident that led to her setting Snape's robes on fire demonstrated how completely her priorities had shifted from rule-following to friend-protecting, her willingness to take dramatic action when she believed Harry was in danger, revealing depths of loyalty that even she hadn't recognized within herself. The fact that her intervention was misdirected, protecting Harry from Professor Quirrell rather than Professor Snape, didn't diminish the significance of her willingness to act decisively when action was required. Her research into Nicholas Flamel exemplified her unique contributions to their investigative partnership, her ability to locate obscure information and connect historical facts with contemporary events, providing crucial insights that moved their understanding beyond surface observation to genuine comprehension of the magical forces at work. The discovery that the three-headed dog was protecting the Philosopher's Stone gave context and urgency to mysteries that had previously seemed like academic puzzles rather than immediate threats. The dragon incident with Norbert tested her commitment to friendship against her respect for school rules, forcing her to choose between personal safety and loyalty to Hagrid's predicament. Her participation in the plan to move the dragon demonstrated how completely her moral framework had evolved since arriving at Hogwarts, prioritizing compassionate action over institutional compliance when circumstances demanded choices between competing values. The consequences of being caught out of bed were severe and personally painful, as the loss of house points made her temporarily despised by fellow Gryffindors who had previously begun to accept her as a valuable member of their community. The experience of social rejection was devastating for someone who had finally found belonging, but it also taught her important lessons about the costs of doing what was right and the temporary nature of popular opinion when measured against genuine moral conviction. The detention in the Forbidden Forest provided her first extended exposure to the dark creatures and dangerous magical environments that existed beyond the relative safety of castle walls, experiences that would prove invaluable preparation for the trials that awaited in future years. The forest itself was revelation of magical ecosystem that operated according to principles far more complex than any textbook could convey, filled with creatures whose intelligence and motives exceeded anything she had encountered in academic study. The final confrontation with the obstacles protecting the Philosopher's Stone became the ultimate test of everything she had learned about friendship, courage, and the practical application of magical knowledge under extreme pressure. Each challenge required different skills and approaches, from the physical problem of Devil's Snare to the logical puzzle of the potions that would allow passage to the final chamber. Her mastery of the plant-based obstacle drew upon botanical knowledge that she had acquired through extensive reading, but success required more than mere information, but the presence of mind to apply academic learning while wrapped in tendrils that tightened with every moment of panic or hesitation. The fire she conjured was proof that magical education was finally providing practical abilities that could mean the difference between life and death when theoretical knowledge met real danger. The potions puzzle represented the perfect synthesis of her analytical abilities and magical education, a challenge that required logical thinking rather than raw magical power or intuitive insight. Her delight at encountering an obstacle, that rewarded careful reasoning over other forms of magical talent, revealed how completely she had embraced her identity as someone whose greatest strengths lay in intelligence and systematic problem-solving rather than dramatic gesture or overwhelming force. But perhaps the most significant moment was her decision to return to safety while allowing Harry to continue alone into the final chamber, recognizing that friendship sometimes required accepting limitations and trusting others to handle challenges that exceeded her own abilities. The choice was emotionally difficult but strategically sound, ensuring that someone would survive to summon help if Harry's confrontation with the final obstacles proved fatal. The 50 points that Dumbledore awarded her for cool use of intellect while others were in grave peril provided official recognition of her unique contributions to their successful protection of the philosopher's stone, but more importantly validated her understanding that intelligence could be a form of courage when applied to dangerous situations that required clear thinking rather than dramatic action. The academic achievements that concluded her first year at Hogwarts were impressive even by her own standards, earning top marks in every subject while also participating in adventures that had tested her character in ways that classroom instruction alone could never accomplish. The girl who had arrived at Hogwarts as brilliant but socially isolated individual had been transformed into someone whose intelligence served friendship and whose knowledge supported courage in the face of genuine danger. The Hogwarts Express that carried her back to King's Cross Station transported a fundamentally different person than the nervous 11-year-old who had first crossed the barrier to platform 9 3/4. Her experiences had provided not just magical education but character development that prepared her for challenges that would demand every resource of intelligence, courage, and loyalty she possessed. The reunion with her parents was both joyful and complex, as she struggled to convey the magnitude of changes that magical education had wrought in her understanding of herself and her place in the world. The adventures she had experienced were beyond anything that Muggle imagination could encompass, while the friendships she had formed were based on shared dangers and mutual dependence that had no equivalent in ordinary adolescent relationships. But beneath the excitement of recounting her first year's achievements lay deeper awareness that her true education was just beginning, that the magical world contained dangers and wonders that would test every assumption she held about right and wrong, possible and impossible. The brightest witch of her age had completed her foundation year, but the trials ahead would require wisdom and courage that could only be developed through continued exposure to the extraordinary demands that magical life placed upon those brave enough to embrace its challenges and opportunities. Welcome to the realm of deeper mysteries and darker revelations, where the brilliant young witch, who had conquered her first year's challenges, discovered that the magical world held secrets far more dangerous and personal than any textbook could reveal. The summer that followed her triumph with the Philosopher's Stone had been filled with eager correspondence and growing concern when silence replaced the letters she had expected from her dearest friends, a silence that spoke of forces working against the connections that had become most precious to her. The correspondence that she had attempted to maintain with Harry and Ron throughout the long summer months represented more than mere social contact but lifelines to the magical world that had become her true home. Each unanswered letter increased her worry that something terrible had happened to prevent their replies. Her analytical mind, conjuring increasingly dire explanations for the communication breakdown that left her isolated in the Muggle world, with parents who couldn't understand the depth of her concern for friends they had never met. Her return to Diagon Alley brought relief and revelation in equal measure, the joy of reuniting with the Weasley family and discovering that Harry was safe, combining with her first encounter with celebrity culture in the magical world. Gilderoy Lockhart's book signing represented her introduction to fame as performance rather than achievement. Charisma divorced from substance in ways that would prove both educational and ultimately disappointing as she learned to distinguish between genuine accomplishment and mere self-promotion. The excitement of meeting her literary hero was genuine and overwhelming, her admiration for his published adventures, combining with adolescent attraction to his undeniable handsomeness in ways that clouded her normally sharp judgment. The books on their required reading list bore his name and promised insights into defense against the dark arts that would enhance her magical education, while his personal magnetism suggested depths of character that matched his documented achievements in the field. But beneath her enthusiasm lay the analytical mind that had served her so well in academic pursuits, quietly noting discrepancies between Lockhart's public persona and the details that didn't quite align with his carefully constructed image. The observations remained subconscious during their first meeting, overshadowed by starstruck admiration and the social pressure to share her classmates' enthusiasm for their glamorous new professor. The encounter with Lucius Malfoy that interrupted their pleasant shopping expedition provided her first direct exposure to the casual cruelty and entrenched prejudice that existed within certain segments of magical society. His dismissive comment about the company that Arthur Weasley kept, delivered while looking directly at her parents with obvious disdain, revealed attitudes that transcended mere social snobbery to embrace genuine malevolence toward those deemed inferior by accident of birth. The confrontation escalated in ways that demonstrated the barely contained violence that simmered beneath the surface of wizarding social interactions. Magical wands drawn in public spaces while children watched their parents prepare for combat that could have devastating consequences for everyone involved. The resolution was temporary and unsatisfying, leaving tensions unresolved and making clear that the conflicts between different factions in the magical world extended far beyond academic disagreement into personal hatred that could explode without warning. Her journey back to Hogwarts on the Hogwarts Express was marked by confusion over Harry and Ron's absence, their failure to board the train, creating anxiety that persisted until she learned about their dramatic arrival by flying car. Her disapproval of their reckless journey was motivated by genuine concern for their safety rather than mere rule following, understanding that magical transportation carried risks that could prove fatal when attempted by inexperienced students without proper preparation or adult supervision. The opening feast that year carried undertones of tension that had been absent during her first year, subtle signs that the magical world was experiencing pressures that would soon manifest in ways that challenged every assumption about safety within Hogwarts walls. The arrival of their new defense professor was greeted with enthusiasm that she shared, despite her growing awareness that celebrity didn't necessarily correlate with competence in ways that academic achievement always had. The first direct confrontation with blood-based prejudice came during the Quidditch altercation that revealed the depth of hatred that some pure-blood families harbored toward those they considered inferior by virtue of parentage, rather than ability or character. Draco Malfoy's use of the term mudblood carried venom that transcended mere insult to embrace systematic devaluation of her very right to exist in the magical world, reducing her achievements and potential to the accident of her birth to non-magical parents. The word itself was unfamiliar, but its meaning was unmistakable from the horrified reactions of everyone who heard it. The sudden silence that followed Malfoy's declaration, making clear that he had crossed lines that even school rivalry didn't normally breach. The term represented centuries of prejudice, distilled into a single epithet designed to wound and diminish, carrying implications that extended far beyond personal insult to embrace institutional oppression and systematic exclusion. Ron's violent reaction to Malfoy's slur demonstrated loyalty that transcended house rivalries and social boundaries, his willingness to risk serious injury in defense of her honor, revealing character depths that his casual demeanor often concealed. The backfire of his curse due to his broken wand provided unintended but satisfying justice, forcing him to experience personally the humiliation and physical discomfort that he had attempted to inflict on someone who had insulted his friend. The explanation that followed, delivered jointly by Ron and Hagrid with obvious discomfort and barely controlled anger, revealed the systematic nature of magical prejudice and its roots in ideology that denied the fundamental equality of all magical practitioners, regardless of their ancestry. The term mudblood was revealed as the most offensive designation possible for someone of her background, carrying connotations that reduced her magical abilities to contamination, rather than recognizing them as gifts that deserved respect and cultivation. Her reaction to learning the full meaning of the slur was characteristically analytical rather than emotional, processing the implications of systematic prejudice while refusing to allow others' ignorance to diminish her own self-worth or commitment to magical education. The knowledge that some people would always view her as inherently inferior because of circumstances beyond her control was painful but not devastating, serving instead as motivation to prove through achievement that merit mattered more than ancestry. The defense against the dark arts classes with Professor Lockhart provided ongoing demonstration of the gap between reputation and reality, his theatrical teaching style favoring showmanship over substance in ways that became increasingly obvious to students who needed practical knowledge rather than entertainment. The quiz that opened their first lesson was focused entirely on personal details about Lockhart himself, rather than defensive magic, revealing priorities that placed self-promotion above educational responsibility. Her perfect score on the narcissistic quiz earned Lockhart's approval, while simultaneously highlighting the inadequacy of their magical education under someone more interested in maintaining his celebrity status than preparing students for real dangers. The questions about his favorite color and secret ambitions were trivial compared to the life-saving knowledge they needed about identifying and countering dark magic. But her academic instincts compelled her to excel even in assignments that she increasingly recognized as meaningless. The crush that she developed on Professor Lockhart was typical adolescent infatuation, complicated by her limited experience with romantic feelings and her tendency to admire achievement that she later discovered was largely fabricated. Her attraction was based on his carefully constructed public image rather than genuine compatibility or shared values, making it educational experience in distinguishing between surface appeal and deeper character traits that actually mattered in relationships. The opening of the Chamber of Secrets introduced element of genuine terror into what had previously been academic year marked by poor teaching and social tensions but not immediate physical danger. The petrification of Mrs. Norris was followed by ominous message written in blood that promised more attacks against students like herself, those whose magical abilities were deemed contaminated by their non-magical heritage. Her research into the Chamber's history demonstrated both her investigative abilities and her growing understanding that academic knowledge could be literally life-saving when applied to situations where inadequate information might result in death or permanent injury. The legend of Salazar Slytherin and his monster provided context for attacks that seemed random but were actually systematic, targeting of specific student populations based on blood status rather than individual behavior or choices. The polyjuice potion brewing that she initiated represented her most ambitious magical undertaking to date, requiring not just theoretical knowledge but practical skills that pushed the boundaries of what second-year students were expected to attempt. The complexity of the potion was matched by the risks involved in brewing it without adult supervision, understanding that failure could result in permanent transformation or worse consequences that made their investigation extremely dangerous. The advanced magic required months of careful preparation in secret locations where discovery would result in expulsion and possibly criminal charges for unauthorized brewing of restricted substances. Each ingredient had to be obtained through methods that skirted school rules, while avoiding detection by professors who would immediately recognize the implications of their shopping list and put a stop to their investigation. Her role in the brewing process was both leadership and education, teaching Harry and Ron techniques that went far beyond their current curriculum, while managing logistics that required careful planning and flawless execution over extended time periods. The responsibility was enormous for someone her age, but her confidence in her abilities was matched by understanding that conventional approaches to the mystery were proving inadequate for discovering the truth about the chamber's opening. The cat hair incident that ruined her portion of the polyjuice potion was devastating both practically and emotionally, forcing her to spend weeks in the hospital wing, while her friends proceeded with their investigation using methods that didn't include her analytical abilities. The physical transformation that resulted from her mistake was distressing but temporary, while the isolation from her friends during crucial phases of their investigation felt like abandonment that she had brought upon herself through carelessness. The weeks of recovery provided time for reflection on the risks she had accepted in pursuit of knowledge that might protect herself and other Muggle-born students from whatever creature was causing the petrifications. The hospital wing became temporary prison where she processed both her mistake and her determination to contribute more carefully to future investigations that might mean the difference between life and death for students who couldn't protect themselves. Her research into the monster's identity represented triumph of systematic investigation over panic and speculation. Her ability to connect diverse sources of information into coherent theory that explained not just what was attacking students, but how it moved through the school without detection. The revelation that a basilisk was using the plumbing system to travel throughout Hogwarts demonstrated how dangerous creatures could exploit infrastructure that was designed for convenience rather than security. The mirror that she carried for protection was practical application of academic knowledge under life-threatening circumstances, understanding that direct eye contact with the basilisk would prove fatal, while indirect observation through reflective surfaces would cause petrification rather than death. The precaution that she shared with Penelope Clearwater was based on theoretical understanding transformed into survival strategy that might save their lives when faced with creature that could kill with a glance. The petrification attack that claimed both herself and Penelope was simultaneously validation of her research and demonstration of its limitations, proving that she had correctly identified the monster, while also revealing that knowledge alone was insufficient protection against creatures whose magical abilities exceeded normal defensive measures. The page torn from the library book and clutched in her petrified hand was her final contribution to the investigation, providing Harry and Ron with information they needed to locate the chamber and confront the basilisk directly. The months of stone-like suspension were experienced as dreamless void rather than conscious imprisonment, her awareness suspended between life and death, while her body remained perfectly preserved by magic that was both protective and imprisoning. The experience was unique among her educational adventures, representing complete helplessness rather than active participation in events that would determine not just her own fate but the future of Muggle-born students throughout the school. Her recovery came with mandrake restoration that was both magical healing and rebirth, awakening from months of suspension to discover that Harry and Ron had successfully resolved the mystery that she had helped them understand. The reunion was joyful and emotional, validation that their friendship had survived separation and that her contributions had been valued even during her absence from the final confrontation with Tom Riddle's memory and the basilisk. The knowledge that she had been correct about the monster's identity and methods provided satisfaction that academic achievement always brought, but tempered by awareness that being right about dangerous situations carried responsibilities that extended beyond mere intellectual satisfaction. Her research had been essential to the mystery's resolution, but the costs of acquiring that knowledge had been higher than she had anticipated when she first began investigating the chamber's opening. The end of her second year brought academic recognition that reflected her continued excellence, despite the extraordinary circumstances that had disrupted normal educational activities, her grades maintaining their exceptional standards while she also contributed to adventures that tested her character in ways that classroom instruction alone could never accomplish. The girl who had struggled with social acceptance during her first year had proven herself indispensable to friends whose loyalty was now absolute and unquestioned. The summer that followed provided time for reflection on lessons learned about prejudice and courage. Her understanding of the magical world deepened by direct exposure to forces that threatened students like herself, simply because of circumstances beyond their control. The experience had been educational in ways that extended far beyond academic curriculum, teaching her about systematic oppression and the importance of standing against it, even when resistance carried personal costs that were difficult to calculate in advance. The train journey home carried someone who had been fundamentally changed by experiences that challenged every comfortable assumption about magical education as merely advanced learning rather than preparation for battles between good and evil that would define her generation's contribution to wizarding history. The brightest witch of her age had survived her second year, but the trials ahead would require wisdom and courage that could only be developed through continued exposure to dangers that testing every limit of her intelligence, determination, and moral conviction. Welcome to the year of impossible schedules and expanding horizons, where the brightest witch of her age discovered that even time itself could be bent to serve the pursuit of knowledge, though at costs that would test the limits of human endurance and magical possibility. The summer that preceded her third year had been spent in France with her parents, absorbing different approaches to magical culture, while processing the traumatic events that had marked her second year at Hogwarts, with experiences that no amount of academic preparation could have anticipated. The family holiday in France provided welcome respite from the intensity of magical education, allowing her to observe how different cultures approached the integration of magical and non-magical communities. The French wizarding world operated with subtlety that contrasted sharply with the rigid separation maintained in Britain, offering perspectives on magical society that broadened her understanding of possibilities that existed beyond the assumptions that had shaped her early magical education. Her parents had watched her return from her second year with mixture of pride and concern, recognizing that their daughter was being shaped by experiences that exceeded anything their own education had provided, while also noting changes in her character that spoke of premature exposure to genuine danger. The conversations they shared during their French holiday revealed depths of maturity that seemed inappropriate for someone her age, wisdom purchased through confrontations with evil that had left invisible scars alongside her academic achievements. The purchase of Crookshanks from the magical menagerie represented more than acquisition of a pet, but recognition of her need for companionship that understood the magical world in ways that her parents, despite their love and support, simply could not. The half-Kneasel's intelligence was immediately apparent, his ability to distinguish between trustworthy and dangerous individuals, providing magical insight that would prove invaluable in situations where human judgment might be compromised by appearance or deception. Her decision to take every available elective course reflected characteristic ambition, combined with growing awareness that magical education represented limited opportunity to acquire knowledge that might prove essential in future. Challenges that she couldn't yet anticipate. The impossibility of attending classes that were scheduled simultaneously seemed like obstacle that logic should be able to overcome, particularly in institution where magic routinely accomplished feats that defied conventional understanding of natural law. The private meeting with Professor McGonagall that preceded the start of term carried weight that extended far beyond normal academic advising, representing recognition that exceptional students sometimes required exceptional accommodations to achieve their full potential. The time turner that McGonagall entrusted to her was artifact of incredible power and responsibility, magical device that could alter the fundamental nature of reality, while remaining completely secret from even her closest friends. The restrictions that accompanied the time turner's use were absolute and non-negotiable, reflecting understanding that temporal magic carried risks that could affect not just individual users, but the entire fabric of reality, if employed carelessly or for purposes beyond educational necessity. Her promise to limit its use to attending classes and never to reveal its existence even to Harry and Ron represented oath that would isolate her in ways that she hadn't fully anticipated when accepting the additional academic burden. The impossible schedule that resulted from her course selections created daily challenges that pushed the boundaries of human endurance while providing educational opportunities that no previous student had ever attempted. Each day became exercise in careful timing and precise execution, moving between classes that existed simultaneously in different parts of the castle while maintaining the illusion that she possessed normal human limitations regarding presence and temporal continuity. The confusion that her schedule created for Harry and Ron was a painful reminder of the isolation that exceptional achievements often required, their inability to understand how she appeared in multiple locations simultaneously, forcing her to maintain deceptions that contradicted the honesty that had always characterized their friendship. The lies were necessary for maintaining the time turner's secrecy, but they created distance that she felt acutely, even when surrounded by friends who cared about her deeply. The divination classes with Professor Trelawney represented clash between analytical thinking and mystical approaches to knowledge that highlighted fundamental differences between genuine academic inquiry and performance masquerading as education. The subject matter itself held potential interest for someone curious about all forms of magical knowledge, but Trelawney's theatrical presentation and obvious charlatanism offended her intellectual sensibilities in ways that made continued participation increasingly difficult. Her walkout from divination became symbolic rejection of educational approaches that prioritized drama over substance, choosing intellectual integrity over social conformity, even when the decision carried academic consequences that might affect her future educational opportunities. The gesture was both personal liberation and philosophical statement about the difference between genuine learning and mere entertainment disguised as instruction. The care of magical creatures lessons with Hagrid provided welcome contrast to Trelawney's theatrical nonsense, offering hands-on experience with creatures that represented genuine magical phenomena worthy of serious study and respect. Hagrid's teaching style was unconventional but authentic, based on real knowledge and genuine passion for his subject, rather than artificial mystique, designed to impress rather than educate. The incident with Buckbeak and Draco Malfoy demonstrated how quickly educational opportunities could become dangerous when students failed to follow proper protocols or approached magical creatures with arrogance rather than respect. Malfoy's deliberate provocation of the hippogriff was motivated by desire to cause trouble rather than genuine interest in learning, creating crisis that threatened both creature and student, while providing excuse for pure-blood supremacists to attack Hagrid's competence as educator. Her immediate commitment to researching hippogriff lore and magical creature rights reflected both loyalty to Hagrid and growing awareness that justice in the magical world often required active advocacy rather than passive faith in do sin. Institutional fairness. The legal research she conducted was far more advanced than anything typically undertaken by third-year students, requiring navigation of complex magical jurisprudence, while building arguments that could withstand scrutiny from experienced legal professionals, motivated by prejudice rather than justice. The hours she spent in the library, researching precedents and preparing briefs, represented sacrifice of personal time and social activities in service of cause that mattered more than her individual comfort or convenience. The work was difficult and sometimes discouraging, particularly when she discovered how often magical courts had ruled against creatures based on bias rather than evidence. But it provided valuable education in advocacy and legal reasoning that would prove essential in future battles against systematic oppression. The firebolt incident that temporarily damaged her relationships with Harry and Ron was motivated by genuine concern for Harry's safety, rather than desire to spoil his enjoyment or demonstrate superior knowledge of magical security procedures. Her decision to inform Professor McGonagall about the mysterious gift reflected understanding that unknown sources of expensive magical items often carried dangers that recipients might not recognize until too late to prevent disaster. The weeks of coldness from her best friends were painful punishment for prioritizing their safety over their immediate happiness, teaching her difficult lessons about the costs of making unpopular decisions based on careful analysis rather than emotional impulse. The isolation was made worse by her knowledge that she was correct to be suspicious, that anonymous gifts to someone as famous and targeted as Harry Potter required investigation rather than immediate acceptance and use. The reconciliation that followed validation of her concerns was sweet but incomplete, marking renewal of their friendship, while also establishing pattern where her analytical approach to dangerous situations would sometimes conflict with their more intuitive responses to immediate circumstances. The dynamic would be repeated throughout their remaining years at Hogwarts, her caution balancing their courage, while their action-oriented approach pushed her beyond purely theoretical responses to practical problems. Her discovery of Professor Lupin's werewolf identity through careful observation of Snape's substitute lesson demonstrated analytical abilities that exceeded those of her classmates, while also revealing her capacity for discretion when disclosure might harm someone who didn't deserve additional persecution. The knowledge was burden that she carried alone, understanding that Lupin's condition was medical rather than moral issue, while also recognizing the prejudice that werewolves faced in magical society. Her decision not to expose Lupin reflected growing sophistication in moral reasoning, understanding that truth-telling wasn't always the highest ethical obligation when revelation might destroy someone whose only crime was suffering from condition beyond their control. The choice represented evolution from rule-following to principle-based decision-making that would characterize her approach to ethical dilemmas throughout her remaining time at Hogwarts. The research she conducted into werewolf legislation and social attitudes provided education in systematic oppression that paralleled her own experiences with blood-based prejudice, while extending her understanding to other marginalized groups within magical society. The knowledge was disturbing but necessary, revealing patterns of discrimination that affected multiple populations, while highlighting the need for advocacy and reform that transcended individual cases or personal grievances. The revelation about Sirius Black, Peter Pettigrew, and the truth behind the Potters' deaths provided shocking education in how completely official narratives could distort reality, when those in power had incentives to avoid uncomfortable truths. The discovery that an innocent man had spent 12 years in Azkaban, while the real traitor lived as respected member of wizarding society, challenged every assumption about justice and institutional reliability that her upbringing had instilled. Her processing of these revelations was characteristically analytical, working through implications and consequences, while Harry and Ron responded with more emotional reactions to the personal betrayals and family connections that the truth revealed. Her ability to remain focused on facts rather than feelings proved essential during the chaotic events that followed, providing stability that allowed them to make rational decisions under extreme pressure. The Time Turner mission that concluded their third year was culmination of everything she had learned about temporal magic and careful planning, requiring precise execution of complex plan while avoiding paradoxes that could unravel reality itself. The experience was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying, demonstrating the awesome power that magical devices could provide while highlighting the enormous responsibility that accompanied such capabilities. The successful rescue of both Buckbeak and Sirius Black validated her understanding that careful analysis and methodical preparation could accomplish objectives that seemed impossible through conventional approaches. But it also revealed the psychological costs of manipulating time and living through events from multiple perspectives simultaneously. The knowledge of how easily timelines could be altered was burden that would affect her understanding of causality and free will for years to come. Her academic performance throughout the year maintained exceptional standards despite the impossible demands of her course load and the emotional challenges created by the year's dramatic events, proving that intellectual achievement remained possible even under circumstances that would have overwhelmed students with less dedication or natural ability. The decision to drop some elective courses for the following year reflected mature recognition of human limitations rather than admission of failure. The Time Turner's return to Professor McGonagall marked end of experiment that had been successful academically but unsustainable personally, teaching valuable lessons about the balance between ambition and wisdom that would guide her future educational choices. The device had provided unprecedented learning opportunities, while also demonstrating that some achievements required sacrifices that were ultimately counterproductive to overall development and well-being. Her relationship with Crookshanks had evolved throughout the year from simple pet ownership to genuine partnership between magical beings who understood and supported each other's unique abilities and perspectives. The cat's intelligence and magical heritage made him ideal companion for someone whose own exceptional abilities sometimes created isolation from purely human relationships, while his protective instincts had proven valuable in situations where human judgment alone might have been insufficient. The summer that followed her third year provided necessary respite from the intensity of temporal magic and impossible schedules, allowing her to process experiences that had pushed the boundaries of what any student should attempt while planning more sustainable approaches to her remaining years at Hogwarts. The girl who returned home had been changed by encounters with time itself, carrying wisdom about the nature of reality and responsibility that exceeded anything normal magical education typically provided. The knowledge that she had successfully manipulated time to save innocent lives was source of pride, tempered by understanding of how easily such power could be misused by those with less noble motivations or careful judgment. The responsibility she had accepted and discharged successfully provided confidence in her own capabilities while highlighting the importance of using exceptional abilities in service of justice rather than personal advantage. Her parents observed changes in their daughter that reflected not just academic growth, but character development that had been accelerated by exposure to moral complexities that challenged every assumption about right and wrong, truth and justice. The conversations they shared during summer holiday revealed depths of thought and sophisticated ethical reasoning that seemed both admirable and concerning in someone so young. The third year had concluded with validation of her unique contributions to their ongoing struggle against forces that threatened not just individual students, but the fundamental principles of justice and equality that should define civilized magical society. Her analytical abilities had proven essential for unraveling mysteries that conventional investigation had failed to solve, while her moral courage had supported decisions that challenged institutional authority when such challenges were necessary for protecting the innocent. The train journey home carried someone who had been transformed by experiences with temporal magic and moral complexity that would influence every future decision and relationship, carrying forward lessons about the nature of time, truth, and responsibility that would prove essential preparation for challenges that lay ahead in a magical world where dark forces were gathering strength for conflicts that would test every limit of courage, intelligence, and dedication to justice. Welcome to the year of international competition and growing awareness, where the brightest witch of her age discovered that the magical world extended far beyond the familiar walls of Hogwarts to encompass cultures, challenges, and connections that would reshape her understanding of what it meant to be part of a global community of magical practitioners. The summer preceding her 4th year had been marked by anticipation that exceeded even her characteristic enthusiasm for learning, as news of the Quidditch World Cup promised experiences that would dwarf anything her previous magical education had provided. The invitation to attend the World Cup with the Weasley family represented acceptance into magical society that transcended mere friendship, marking her recognition as someone whose presence was valued at events that brought together the most prominent figures in the international wizarding community. The weeks leading up to the tournament were filled with research into Quidditch history, team statistics, and cultural backgrounds of competing nations that reflected her systematic approach to any new experience that might provide educational opportunities. The journey to the World Cup campsite provided her first glimpse of magical event organization on unprecedented scale. The logistical challenges of accommodating thousands of international visitors while maintaining secrecy from Muggle authorities, requiring coordination that impressed someone who appreciated complex planning and flawless execution. The temporary magical city that arose around the Quidditch pitch demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything she had previously witnessed in terms of magical construction and community organization. The stadium itself was architectural marvel that challenged every assumption about the limitations of magical construction, its capacity and design representing achievements that surpassed anything possible through non-magical engineering while maintaining aesthetic beauty that honored both function and form. The atmosphere within the arena pulsed with excitement that transcended national boundaries, creating a sense of shared appreciation for athletic excellence that reminded her of the positive aspects of competition when conducted with honor and mutual respect. Her first encounter with Victor Krum was memorable not for romantic implications that others would later read into their interaction, but for her recognition of genuine excellence in someone who had achieved mastery in field that commanded international respect and admiration. The Bulgarian seeker's performance during the match was demonstration of skill developed through dedication that paralleled her own approach to magical studies, though applied to physical rather than purely intellectual pursuits that required different but equally demanding forms of preparation and natural talent. The Death Eater attack that shattered the celebratory atmosphere provided her first direct exposure to organized dark magic on scale that dwarfed anything she had encountered during her previous adventures at Hogwarts. The masked figures who terrorized Muggle family members were operating with coordination that spoke of planning and resources that exceeded random criminal activity, representing systematic approach to inflicting suffering that revealed depths of malevolence she had previously encountered only in historical accounts. Her encounter with Winky, the house elf during the chaos that followed the Death Eater attack, provided shocking introduction to forms of magical slavery that existed within the very foundations of wizarding society, institutional oppression that was so normalized that most magical practitioners never questioned its fundamental injustice. The house elf's terror of heights was forced to endure while serving her master's convenience demonstrated casual cruelty that was accepted as natural rather than recognized as systematic abuse of vulnerable magical beings. The discovery that house elves were bound by magical compulsions that prevented them from disobeying their master's commands, regardless of how unreasonable or cruel those commands might be, sparked indignation that would drive her advocacy efforts throughout her remaining years at Hogwarts and beyond. The realization that magical society was built upon foundation of enslaved labor challenged every assumption she had developed about the ethical superiority of magical over Muggle civilization. Her research into house elf history and legal status revealed centuries of systematic oppression that had been justified through ideologies that dehumanized entire populations of magical beings, reducing them to property rather than recognizing their intelligence, emotions, and inherent right to freedom and self-determination. The parallels to historical forms of human slavery were obvious and disturbing, highlighting moral blindness that pervaded magical society despite its supposed commitment to justice and enlightenment. The founding of the Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare represented her first independent activism, translating moral outrage into organized effort that could potentially create meaningful change in attitudes and policies that had persisted unchallenged for generations. The acronym SPAY was unfortunate but memorable, providing easy way for supporters and critics alike to reference her campaign, while also revealing the dismissive attitude that many magical practitioners held toward any challenge to established social hierarchies. Her badge-making and fundraising efforts met with responses that ranged from polite indifference to active hostility, reactions that taught her valuable lessons about the difficulty of changing deeply entrenched systems of oppression when those systems benefited from widespread acceptance and institutional support. Even friends like Harry and Ron participated reluctantly, supporting her efforts more from personal loyalty than genuine conviction about the importance of house elf liberation. The resistance she encountered from the house elves themselves was particularly frustrating and educationally significant, revealing how completely systematic oppression could internalize itself within victim populations who had been conditioned to view their subjugation as natural and proper, rather than recognizing it as injustice that deserved challenge and correction. The Hogwarts kitchen elves' rejection of her advocacy demonstrated the psychological damage that centuries of slavery had inflicted on magical beings who could no longer imagine alternatives to their current situation. The arrival of international delegations for the Triwizard Tournament provided welcome distraction from the frustrations of house elf advocacy, while opening new perspectives on magical education and cultural approaches that existed beyond the British wizarding world. The students from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang brought different traditions and techniques that enriched the educational environment while also creating competitive dynamics that would test existing friendships and loyalties in unexpected ways. Victor Krumm's selection as Durmstrang champion was unsurprising given his international fame and demonstrated magical abilities, but his subsequent attention to her was initially puzzling and eventually flattering in ways that she had never experienced from male peers, who typically viewed her intelligence as intimidating rather than attractive. His interest seemed genuine rather than calculated, based on appreciation for her character and abilities, rather than superficial attraction or social positioning. The library encounters that marked the beginning of their friendship were conducted in an atmosphere of mutual respect and intellectual curiosity that contrasted sharply with the giggling admiration that Krumm received from other female students. Her ability to maintain normal conversation with someone whose fame made simple social interaction difficult for most people was based on her genuine interest in his perspectives on magical education and international Quidditch, rather than starstruck fascination with his celebrity status. Their discussions revealed intelligence and thoughtfulness that contradicted stereotypes about athletes being focused solely on physical achievement rather than intellectual development, while his questions about her studies and ambitions demonstrated respect for academic excellence that was refreshing after years of being viewed as oddity rather than asset by many of her peers. The friendship that developed was based on mutual recognition of exceptional abilities and shared commitment to excellence in their respective fields. The Halloween selection of champions created excitement that was tempered by her immediate recognition that Harry's name, emerging from the Goblet of Fire, represented manipulation rather than legitimate entry. Analysis that was based on understanding of magical contracts and tournament history rather than simple faith in her friend's honesty. The binding nature of the magical selection meant that investigation into how the entry had been accomplished would have to wait until after the tournament's completion. The rift that developed between Harry and Ron was painful to observe and navigate, requiring diplomatic skills that she had never needed to develop while mediating between friends whose pride and insecurity made rational discussion difficult, despite their underlying care for each other. Her role as intermediary was complicated by her own emotional investment in their friendship, while also trying to maintain objective perspective on situation that was affecting all their academic and social relationships. Rita Skeeter's arrival at Hogwarts introduced element of malicious journalism that would plague Harry throughout the tournament, while also providing her with first direct exposure to media manipulation and the power of publicity to shape public perception regardless of factual accuracy. The reporter's approach to gathering information was predatory rather than investigative, seeking sensational stories that would attract readers, rather than truthful accounts that might inform public understanding. The article that portrayed Harry as a tragic figure struggling with fame and romantic complications was deliberately inflammatory rather than informative, designed to generate controversy and emotional response, rather than provide insights into the genuine challenges that tournament participation created for someone Harry's age. The fabricated quotes and misleading implications demonstrated how easily media could distort reality when reporters prioritized entertainment value over journalistic integrity. Her own inclusion in Skeeter's narrative as Harry's supposed romantic interest was both embarrassing and enlightening, revealing how quickly private relationships could become public entertainment when journalists were willing to sacrifice accuracy for readability. The experience taught valuable lessons about media literacy and the importance of critical evaluation of published information, particularly when that information concerned subjects about which readers had emotional investment. The first task of the tournament provided opportunity to observe Harry's performance under extreme pressure, while also analyzing the magical techniques and strategic approaches that different champions employed when facing genuine, physical danger. Her assistance in helping him master the summoning charm was typical of her supportive role in their friendship, providing practical help that enhanced his natural abilities, while allowing him to develop confidence in his own magical capabilities. The success of Harry's approach to the Dragon Challenge validated her belief in preparation and systematic problem-solving over improvisation and raw courage, though she recognized that optimal performance required combination of careful planning and ability to adapt when circumstances deviated from expected parameters. The scoring that followed confirmed her analysis, while also highlighting subjective elements in evaluation that could be influenced by factors beyond pure performance quality. The Yule Ball announcement created social pressures that she had never experienced, transforming her from observer of romantic complications into participant in dynamics that challenged her understanding of herself and her relationships with male peers who had previously shown little interest in her as anything other than source of homework assistance, or academic competition. The realization that someone as internationally prominent as Victor Krum was interested in inviting her to the ball was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. Her acceptance of Krum's invitation was based on genuine liking for him as person rather than excitement about attending with famous champion, though she understood that others would inevitably interpret her decision in terms of social climbing or attention-seeking, rather than recognizing authentic friendship that had developed through weeks of library conversations and mutual respect. The preparation for the ball required attention to appearance and social presentation that she had never prioritized before. The transformation that accompanied her ball preparation was both physical and psychological, representing conscious decision to present herself as young woman rather than merely exceptional student whose appearance was secondary to academic achievement. The attention to hair, dress, and makeup was educational experience in self-presentation that complemented her intellectual development while also challenging assumptions about the incompatibility of academic excellence and feminine appearance. The ball itself exceeded her expectations in terms of both personal enjoyment and social education, providing her with first experience of being valued for qualities beyond academic performance, while also revealing the complexity of romantic relationships and the emotional challenges that accompanied growing up within context of international attention and social expectations that extended far beyond normal adolescent développement. The dancing and conversation that filled the evening demonstrated Krum's genuine interest in her personality and perspectives, rather than mere desire for impressive companion, while also providing her with insights into life as international celebrity and the isolation that often accompanied fame and public recognition. Their connection was based on shared experience of being viewed as exceptional by others, while struggling to maintain normal relationships and personal authenticity. The confrontation with Ron that concluded the evening was painful revelation of feelings that had remained unspoken and dynamics that had been developing beneath the surface of their friendship, without conscious acknowledgement from any of the participants. His jealousy and accusations were hurtful precisely because they revealed depth of emotion that she had hoped existed but never been directly expressed. The argument that followed was their most serious disagreement since becoming friends, touching on issues of loyalty, romantic autonomy, and social expectations that complicated every aspect of their relationship, while also highlighting differences in maturity and emotional understanding that had been masked by their shared adventures and academic collaboration. The resolution was temporary and incomplete, leaving underlying tensions that would affect their interactions throughout the remaining tournament events. The second task revealed that she had been selected as the thing that Victor would miss most, designation that was both flattering and concerning given the relatively short duration of their acquaintance and the implications for his emotional attachment that such selection suggested. Her role as hostage required trust in magical protections and tournament organization that she found difficult to maintain while unconscious and dependent on others for her safety and successful rescue. The underwater experience was dreamlike suspension of normal consciousness that provided unique perspective on magical capabilities and tournament challenges, while also demonstrating trust between international students that transcended national boundaries and competitive pressures. Her rescue by Victor was accomplished with efficiency that spoke of both magical competence and genuine concern for her well-being rather than mere tournament requirement. The conversation that followed her rescue revealed depths of feeling that Victor had developed for her, emotions that exceeded normal friendship while also creating complications that she was not prepared to navigate, given her own uncertainty about romantic relationships and long-term commitments that such feelings implied. His invitation to visit Bulgaria was a gesture of serious intent, rather than casual social contact. Rita Skeeter's coverage of the second task and the conversation that followed created public scrutiny of their relationship that was both unwelcome and inaccurate, transforming private emotions into entertainment for readers who had no understanding of the genuine feelings and personal growth that were involved in her first experience with serious romantic attention from someone she respected and cared about. The hate mail that resulted from Skeeter's articles was her first experience with public hostility based on media portrayal rather than personal knowledge, letters that ranged from crude insults to threats that revealed how easily public opinion could be manipulated when people were given incomplete or distorted information about situations they had never directly observed. The injury from the cursed letter that caused painful boils on her hands was minor compared to psychological damage of discovering how quickly strangers could develop hatred based on fictional accounts of her behavior and motivations. Lesson that would prove valuable preparation for future challenges when media attention would carry even higher stakes and more serious consequences for both personal relationships and public safety. The investigation that led to discovery of Rita Skeeter's animagus ability was triumph of systematic observation and analytical thinking over seemingly impossible mystery, demonstrating how careful attention to details that others overlooked could reveal solutions to problems that appeared unsolvable through conventional investigation methods. The beetle markings around the eyes that matched Skeeter's glasses were crucial evidence that connected insect appearances with unauthorized access to private conversations. The capture and containment of Skeeter in her beetle form was both justice and practical solution to problem of malicious journalism that was affecting not just her own reputation, but Harry's ability to function normally under tournam pressure. The unbreakable charm on the jar that prevented transformation back to human form was advanced magic that demonstrated capabilities she had developed far beyond normal fourth-year curriculum. The bargaining that followed Skeeter's capture established terms that would provide relief from malicious coverage, while also giving her leverage over someone whose influence extended throughout magical media landscape. The threat to reveal Skeeter's unregistered animagus status was serious enough to ensure compliance, while also providing education in practical applications of magical law and regulatory enforcement. The third task and its aftermath brought Harry's account of Voldemort's return, revelation that transformed tournament competition into prelude to renewed war against dark forces that threatened not just British magical society, but international wizarding community that had gathered to celebrate peaceful competition and cultural exchange. The implications were staggering and would require responses that exceeded anything their previous adventures had prepared them to handle. Her immediate acceptance of Harry's account was based on years of friendship and proven reliability rather than independent evidence, though her analytical mind was already working through implications and planning responses that would be necessary if his report proved accurate. The disbelief from official sources and media coverage that would follow made her support even more crucial during period when Harry needed allies who understood both his character and the stakes involved. The train journey home carried someone who had been transformed by international exposure and first serious romantic relationship into young woman, whose understanding of herself and her place in magical society had been fundamentally altered by experiences that combined personal growth with growing awareness of global challenges that would require everything she had learned about magic, friendship, and moral courage in service of causes larger than individual achievement or personal happiness. Welcome to the year of resistance and revelation, where the brightest witch of her age discovered that education sometimes required rebellion against those who would deny students the knowledge they needed to survive in a world where darkness was returning with methodical precision and institutional power was being wielded to suppress inconvenient truths. The summer that preceded her 5th year had been spent at Grimmauld Place, ancient black family mansion that served as headquarters for the Reformed Order of the Phoenix, where adult conversations about war and sacrifice provided sobering education in realities that her previous magical education had never addressed. The house itself was monument to pure blood supremacy and accumulated dark magic, its very walls steeped in centuries of prejudice and cruelty that made her enhanced awareness of systematic oppression feel like physical weight pressing against her consciousness. Every portrait, every piece of furniture, every magical device reflected attitudes that viewed people like herself as inherently inferior, contamination that threatened the purity of magical bloodlines that had been maintained through generations of careful breeding and deliberate exclusion. Her presence in such environment was both symbolic victory and daily reminder of how far magical society still needed to progress before true equality could be achieved. The irony that headquarters for organization dedicated to fighting dark forces was located enshrined to dark ideology, serving as constant lesson about complexity of moral positions and necessity of working within imperfect systems to one, achieve better outcomes than absolute purity of principle might allow. The adult members of the order treated her with respect that reflected recognition of her capabilities and contributions to previous adventures, but their conversations also revealed scope of challenges that exceeded anything her previous experiences had prepared her to understand. The war against Voldemort was not merely conflict between good and evil, but struggle for control of magical society's future direction. Battle that would determine whether principles of equality and justice could prevail against forces that sought to maintain traditional hierarchies through violence and intimidation. Her appointment as prefect alongside Ron was validation of her academic excellence and leadership potential, official recognition that her contributions to Gryffindor House extended beyond mere point earning through exceptional performance to include positive influence on younger students who looked to prefects for guidance and example. The badge was symbol of trust that carried responsibilities she was determined to fulfill with same dedication she brought to all her academic and personal commitments. The position also created additional layer of authority that would prove essential when institutional power was being misused to suppress educational opportunities that students needed to survive in increasingly dangerous magical world. Her prefect status would provide legitimacy for activities that might otherwise be dismissed as mere student rebellion, lending official weight to resistance efforts that challenged inadequate policies and defended educational principles that Hogwarts was founded to uphold. The arrival of Dolores Umbridge as defense against the dark arts professor represented more than mere personnel change but systematic assault on educational freedom and academic integrity that threatened to undermine everything that made Hogwarts exceptional among magical institutions. Her pink exterior and saccharine manner concealed totalitarian impulses that were far more dangerous than honest antagonism would have been, representing corruption of authority that used bureaucratic procedure to impose ideological control over educational content. The High Inquisitor position that Umbridge assumed demonstrated how quickly democratic institutions could be subverted when those in power prioritized political control over educational excellence, transforming oversight mechanisms designed to maintain quality into weapons for suppressing dissent and enforcing conformity to official narratives that contradicted observable reality. The decrees that followed were systematic dismantling of student rights and academic freedom that required coordinated response from those committed to preserving educational integrity. Her recognition that theoretical defense education would prove inadequate when students faced real dark magic was based on analysis of current magical world conditions rather than mere academic preference for practical application over abstract study. The return of Voldemort created immediate dangers that required practical knowledge and defensive capabilities that Umbridge's curriculum deliberately avoided providing, leaving students vulnerable to attacks that official policy pretended were not occurring. The formation of Dumbledore's army represented her first experience in educational leadership that extended beyond helping individual friends with homework to organizing systematic instruction for a group of students whose survival might depend on skills that official curriculum was designed to deny them. The responsibility was enormous, and the risks were substantial. But the alternative was accepting that students would remain defenseless when faced with enemies whose capabilities exceeded anything that theoretical knowledge could counter. The recruitment process required careful evaluation of potential members' trustworthiness and commitment, understanding that single betrayal could result in expulsion or worse consequences for everyone involved in activities that challenged official educational policy. Each conversation was exercise in persuasion and assessment, determining who could be trusted with secrets that carried implications far beyond normal student rule-breaking into territory where mistakes could prove fatal. The meetings themselves were educational experiences that exceeded anything her previous teaching had provided, requiring development of instructional techniques that could accommodate different learning styles and ability levels while maintaining security that would prevent discovery by authorities who viewed their activities as dangerous rebellion rather than necessary education. Each lesson had to be planned with understanding that detection would end their activities and probably result in severe punishment for all participants. Her creation of the enchanted galleons for communication was triumph of practical magic applied to organizational needs, demonstrating capabilities that exceeded normal fifth-year curriculum while providing secure communication method that could coordinate activities without detection by monitoring charms that Umbridge was certainly employing to identify resistance activities. The spell work required was complex and original, requiring innovation rather than mere application of existing techniques. The teaching environment that they created in the Room of Requirement was collaborative rather than hierarchical, with Harry providing practical knowledge, while she contributed organizational structure and theoretical framework that helped students understand principles behind techniques they were learning. The dynamic was educational for her as well, providing experience in leadership and instruction that would prove valuable in future situations where she needed to coordinate group activities under pressure. Her mastery of the Patronus charm represented personal achievement that combined technical magical skill with emotional growth, understanding that the spell required not just proper wand movement and incantation, but psychological state that could sustain positive emotions, even when surrounded by forces designed to drain hope and happiness. The otter form that her Patronus took reflected her personality traits and magical signature in ways that felt deeply personal and appropriate. The advancement of other students under her guidance and Harry's instruction validated her belief that proper education could prepare even average students to defend themselves against dark magic when they received practical training, rather than mere theoretical exposure to concepts they would never be allowed to practice. The improvement in their defensive capabilities was measurable and significant, providing confidence that would serve them well when theoretical knowledge met practical application in life-threatening situations. Her correspondence with Victor Krum continued throughout the year, maintaining connection that had deepened during the Triwizard Tournament, while also creating complications with Ron, whose jealousy over her international friendship revealed feelings that he had never directly acknowledged. The letters were substantial exchanges of ideas and experiences rather than mere social pleasantries, providing perspectives on magical education and international affairs that enriched her understanding of wizarding world beyond British boundaries. The novel-length letter that prompted Ron's particularly obvious displeasure was detailed account of political developments in Bulgaria and analysis of how Voldemort's return was affecting magical communities throughout Europe, information that was far more comprehensive than anything available through official British sources that were committed to denying reality of renewed dark threat. Victor's insights were valuable intelligence that helped her understand scope of challenges that extended far beyond immediate concerns about Hogwarts education. Ron's reaction to her correspondence revealed depth of romantic interest that she had hoped existed, but which he had never been willing to express directly, creating emotional tension that complicated their friendship, while also providing hope that their relationship might eventually develop beyond mere academic collaboration and shared adventures. The jealousy was flattering in some ways, but also frustrating given his refusal to acknowledge or act upon feelings that were obvious to everyone except himself. The Christmas holiday period provided temporary respite from institutional pressure, while also deepening her understanding of adult perspectives on magical war and its implications for future that she and her generation would inherit. The conversations with Order members revealed scope of planning and sacrifice that was required to maintain resistance against forces that controlled official governmental and media channels, demonstrating complexity of opposition that extended far beyond simple moral positions into practical questions of strategy and resource allocation. Her decision to forego skiing vacation with her parents in favor of remaining at Grimmauld Place reflected understanding that her education was occurring as much through exposure to adult resistance activities as through formal classroom instruction, valuable lessons about leadership and moral courage that could only be learned through participation in genuine struggles against systematic oppression. The sacrifice of personal pleasure for greater cause was becoming a pattern that would define many of her future choices. The interview with Rita Skeeter that she arranged and conducted demonstrated sophisticated understanding of media manipulation and public opinion formation that exceeded anything normal magical education would have provided, using Skeeter's vulnerability over her unregistered animagus status to secure favorable coverage for Harry's account of Voldemort's return. The negotiation required careful balance of threat and persuasion, understanding that excessive pressure might backfire, while insufficient motivation would result in continued malicious coverage. The article that appeared in the Quibbler was triumph of alternative media over official propaganda, providing platform for truth that mainstream magical publications were unwilling to acknowledge because of political pressure from ministry officials who preferred comfortable denial to acknowledgement of dangers that would require difficult responses. The success of the article in changing public opinion demonstrated power of accurate information when presented through trusted sources. The discovery and punishment of Dumbledore's army represented catastrophic failure of security that she had worked so hard to maintain, betrayal by Marietta Edgecombe that endangered everyone who had participated in activities that challenged official educational policy. The jinx that she had placed on the membership contract was both revenge and practical demonstration of magical capabilities that exceeded anything normal students were expected to possess. Advanced spell work that created permanent consequences for betrayal that could not be easily reversed. The detention with Umbridge that followed their capture provided direct exposure to authorized torture that was being employed against students who challenged official policies. Blood quill that carved words into her hand, serving as permanent reminder of how quickly institutional authority could become systematic cruelty when those in power prioritize control over justice. The experience was educational in ways that no classroom instruction could provide, revealing true nature of totalitarian impulses that masqueraded as legitimate governance. Her organization of resistance activities during Umbridge's brief tenure as headmistress required leadership skills that exceeded anything her previous experiences had developed, coordinating systematic defiance that maintained educational function, while actively subverting authority figures who were destroying institutions they claimed to protect. The balance between effective resistance and avoiding consequences that would end their ability to continue opposition required careful judgment and constant risk assessment. The battle at the Department of Mysteries represented culmination of everything she had learned about practical magic and combat applications. First genuine fight against adult dark wizards who were using lethal force without hesitation or moral constraint. The spells she employed were more advanced than anything fifth-year curriculum typically covered, while her tactical thinking, under pressure, demonstrated capabilities that would have impressed experienced Aurors who might have criticized her techniques but could not question their effectiveness. Her injury during the battle was both painful validation of dangers they faced and educational experience in magical medicine and healing that provided practical knowledge about spell damage and recovery that academic instruction alone could never have conveyed. The curse that struck her was intended to cause serious harm rather than mere incapacitation, revealing level of malice that exceeded anything she had previously encountered from enemies who viewed her and her friends as legitimate targets for lethal force. The recovery that followed provided time for reflection on experiences that had transformed theoretical understanding of magical conflict into practical knowledge purchased through personal risk and physical suffering, education that prepared her for challenges that would require everything she had learned about magic, friendship, and moral courage, applied under circumstances where failure would mean death or worse for people she cared about most. The outstanding ordinary wizarding level results that concluded her academic year were validation that practical magical education could coexist with academic excellence, proving that real-world application enhanced rather than detracted from theoretical understanding when students were given opportunities to integrate knowledge across different domains and contexts. The 9 outstanding grades reflected mastery that exceeded normal fifth-year standards, while also demonstrating that resistance activities had enriched rather than compromised her formal education. The single exceeds expectations grade in defense against the dark arts was disappointing, but understandable given that official examination could not acknowledge practical knowledge that exceeded approved curriculum. Ironic recognition that her actual defensive capabilities far exceeded what institutional assessment could measure, while official evaluation reflected political rather than educational considerations. The grade was less important than knowledge that she had acquired through experiences that no examination could adequately assess. The summer that followed carried someone who had been transformed by leadership experience and direct combat into young woman whose understanding of magical education had evolved far beyond classroom instruction to encompass practical knowledge that would prove essential in conflicts where academic achievement alone would be insufficient protection against enemies who acknowledged no limits on methods they were willing to employ. The brightest witch of her age had become something more valuable than exceptional student, evolving into leader whose capabilities would be essential for survival in war that would test every assumption about magic, morality, and the prices that freedom demanded from those committed to preserving it. Welcome to the year of deepening shadows and growing affections, where the brightest witch of her age discovered that academic excellence must be balanced against emotional maturation, and that the most complex magical formulas pale in comparison to the intricate mysteries of the human heart when war creates urgency that transforms theoretical understanding into desperate need for connection and meaning. The summer that preceded her 6th year had been marked by growing awareness that Voldemort's return was reshaping magical society in ways that would affect every aspect of their remaining education and future plans. The advanced magical studies that defined her sixth-year curriculum represented pinnacle of Hogwarts education, Newt-level courses that demanded not just memorization and application, but genuine understanding of magical theory at depths that approached the frontiers of current magical knowledge. The transfiguration work that she undertook with Professor McGonagall pushed the boundaries of what human magic could accomplish, requiring precision and power that tested even her exceptional abilities, while providing glimpses of magical mastery that few wizards ever achieved. The non-verbal magic that became standard expectation for advanced students was particularly challenging, requiring internalization of spell mechanics so complete that conscious thought became obstacle rather than assistance to successful casting. Her mastery of silent spell work proceeded more rapidly than that of her classmates. Analytical mind, proving advantageous in understanding theoretical principles, while extensive practice developed muscle memory and magical pathways that made complex casting appear effortless when performed properly. Professor Slughorn's arrival as Potions Master brought teaching style that was dramatically different from Snape's intimidation-based approach, creating classroom environment where her natural abilities could flourish without fear of arbitrary criticism or deliberate sabotage. The Slug Club invitation that followed was recognition of her exceptional talent combined with assessment of her future potential in magical society, acknowledgement that her achievements warranted inclusion among students whose success would reflect favorably on their professor's teaching legacy. The dinner parties and social gatherings that comprised Slug Club activities provided education in networking and political relationship building that was entirely absent from normal Hogwarts curriculum, but essential for anyone seeking to influence magical society through career advancement or policy advocacy. The conversations with distinguished guests revealed how magical achievement translated into practical influence when combined with social skills and strategic thinking that she had never previously considered necessary components of effective advocacy. Her growing romantic feelings for Ron were complicated by his apparent obliviousness to emotional dynamics that seemed obvious to everyone else who observed their interactions, creating frustration that was both personally painful and educationally significant, as she learned that intelligence alone was insufficient for navigating relationships that required emotional vulnerability and clear communication. The feelings themselves were not entirely unexpected, having developed gradually through years of friendship and shared adventures, but their intensity surprised her. The Quidditch tryouts, where she used magic to influence Cormac McLagan's performance, represented moral compromise that she would have found unthinkable during her earlier years at Hogwarts, demonstration of how completely her ethical framework had evolved to embrace situational decision-making rather than absolute adherence to rules when circumstances demanded protection of people she cared about. The Confundus charm was precisely applied and completely effective, ensuring Ron's selection while avoiding detection by observers who might question the legitimacy of his appointment. The justification she constructed for her intervention was sophisticated moral reasoning that balanced competing values and responsibilities, understanding that Ron's success as keeper was important not just for his personal confidence, but for team performance that would affect entire house during season, when external pressures were already creating additional stress for all students. The decision reflected maturation in ethical thinking that acknowledged complexity rather than seeking simple answers to complicated problems. Ron's exclusion from Slug Club invitation was source of tension that highlighted differences in academic achievement and social recognition that had always existed in their friendship, but were becoming more prominent as they approached adulthood and career decisions that would determine their future paths. Her attempts to minimize the significance of the invitation were well-intentioned but ultimately unsuccessful in addressing insecurity that reflected broader questions about worth and potential that he struggled with throughout their relationship. The Christmas party invitation that she extended to Ron was a gesture of inclusion and romantic interest that should have clarified her feelings while providing him with social opportunity that would demonstrate her desire to share important experiences with him. The preparation and anticipation that preceded the event represented emotional vulnerability that was entirely new territory for someone whose previous relationships had been based on intellectual compatibility rather than romantic attraction. The revelation about her kiss with Victor Krum during the previous year created explosive reaction that revealed depth of Ron's romantic jealousy, while also highlighting his inability to express feelings directly rather than through anger and accusation that pushed away the very person he claimed to care about most deeply. The argument that followed was their most serious relationship crisis since becoming friends, touching on fundamental issues of trust, communication, and emotional honesty that would affect their interactions for months to come. The period of coldness that followed their argument was painful for both participants and exhausting for Harry, who found himself mediating between friends whose pride prevented them from addressing underlying issues that made reconciliation seem impossible despite their obvious continued care for each other. The classroom interactions became exercises in deliberate avoidance and pointed politeness that demonstrated how personal conflicts could poison even academic collaboration when emotions were allowed to override rational assessment of poison, shared interests, and common goals. Ron's relationship with Lavender Brown was a transparent attempt to demonstrate his romantic desirability, while simultaneously punishing Hermione for perceived betrayal that was largely manufactured from his own insecurity and inability to communicate feelings directly, rather than through dramatic gesture and passive-aggressive behavior. The public displays of affection that characterized their relationship were designed more for audience effect than genuine romantic expression, creating spectacle that was both embarrassing and clearly unsustainable. Her response to seeing Ron with Lavender was emotional devastation that she had never previously experienced. Combination of romantic disappointment and personal rejection that challenged every assumption she had developed about her own emotional resilience and capacity for managing feelings that couldn't be controlled through intellectual analysis or systematic study. The birds that she conjured and directed at Ron were manifestation of magical power channeled through emotional pain rather than conscious spellcasting. The loneliness that followed was profound and educational, teaching her about emotional dimensions of human experience that academic achievement could never address, while also providing motivation for examining assumptions about relationships and communication that had been based more on theoretical understanding than practical experience. The isolation was made worse by watching Ron's apparent happiness with someone whose intellectual capabilities were clearly inferior to her own, but whose emotional availability was more accessible. Her invitation to Cormac McLaggen as her Christmas party date was calculated revenge that reflected sophisticated understanding of Ron's psychology, while also providing opportunity to observe alternative romantic possibility that might demonstrate whether her feelings for Ron were based on genuine compatibility or merely familiarity and proximity. The decision was emotionally driven rather than rationally planned, representing unusual departure from her normal decision-making processes. The party itself was social disaster that validated her instinctive understanding that intellectual compatibility was essential foundation for any relationship that could survive beyond superficial attraction and social convenience. McLaggen's behavior was both annoying and enlightening, revealing what relationships looked like when based primarily on physical attraction rather than mutual respect, and shared values that could sustain connection through difficulties and disagreements. Ron's simultaneous misery with Lavender provided hopeful indication that his relationship choice had been equally misguided, though his pride and commitment to maintaining face prevented him from acknowledging mistake or taking steps to correct situation that was clearly making both participants unhappy while creating ongoing tension within their friend group that affected everyone's daily experience at Hogwarts. The poisoning incident that nearly killed Ron transformed all petty relationship concerns into life and death perspective that revealed true depth of her feelings, while also demonstrating how quickly personal conflicts could become irrelevant when faced with genuine crisis that threatened fundamental relationships. Her reaction to his condition was immediate and complete, abandoning all pretense of anger or indifference in favor of desperate concern for his survival and recovery. The vigil that she maintained at his bedside was both expression of love and form of penance for allowing pride to interfere with friendship that meant more to her than any romantic complication could diminish. Understanding that losing him permanently would be devastating regardless of whether their relationship ever developed beyond friendship into something more intimate and committed. The experience clarified priorities in ways that intellectual analysis had never managed to accomplish. Ron's semi-conscious utterance of her name during his recovery was hopeful sign that his feelings paralleled her own, despite the confusion and misdirection that had characterized their recent interactions. Validation that their connection transcended romantic competition and social pressure to encompass deeper understanding and mutual care that could survive temporary conflicts and misunderstandings. The moment provided foundation for eventual reconciliation that both participants desperately wanted, but neither had been willing to risk through direct communication. The aftermath of Ron's recovery included gradual cooling of his relationship with Lavender as he processed near-death experience and reassessed priorities that had been distorted by adolescent insecurity and social pressure to demonstrate romantic success rather than pursuing genuine emotional connection with someone who understood and appreciated him completely. The relationship had never been sustainable given its artificial foundation and calculated motivations. Lavender's growing suspicion and eventual confrontation provided opportunity for Ron to end relationship that had become burden rather than pleasure, freeing him to explore more authentic emotional possibilities, while also providing both participants with valuable lessons about difference between genuine romantic compatibility and relationships based primarily on proving points to other people rather than building meaningful connection between the actual participants. Her support for Ron during apparition lessons was returned to normal friendship dynamic that had been disrupted by romantic complications, providing assistance that demonstrated her continued care while avoiding emotional vulnerability that might create additional confusion or conflict when both participants were still processing recent experiences and determining what kind of relationship they wanted to pursue going forward. The advanced potions work that she completed throughout the year represented some of her finest academic achievement, complex magical formulations that required not just technical precision but creative problem-solving and intuitive understanding of magical interactions that couldn't be learned through memorization alone. The theoretical knowledge that she had accumulated through years of dedicated study was finally being applied to practical challenges that tested every aspect of her magical education. The Battle of the Astronomy Tower represented culmination of everything she had learned about practical magic and tactical thinking. First major combat experience, where she was responsible not just for her own survival, but for protecting younger students who were depending on her leadership and magical capabilities to coordinate defense against adult Death Eaters, who were using lethal force without hesitation or moral constraint. The liquid luck that Harry provided before the battle was both protection and recognition of her importance to successful defense of Castle, magical enhancement that would improve her already considerable capabilities while providing insurance against mistakes or unlucky circumstances that could prove fatal when facing enemies whose experience and malevolence exceeded anything that academic preparation could fully anticipate. The defense of Professor Flitwick's office required quick thinking and magical improvisation under extreme pressure, coordinating with Luna Lovegood to protect unconscious Professor, while simultaneously monitoring Corridor for threats that might require immediate response. The responsibility for protecting someone else while maintaining defensive position was more complex than any previous combat experience she had encountered. The stunning of Professor Flitwick by Professor Snape was shocking betrayal that revealed how completely their understanding of loyalties and alliances had been compromised by deceptions that extended to the highest levels of Hogwarts administration, forcing rapid reassessment of situation while maintaining defensive protocols that might be all that stood between students and Death Eaters who had infiltrated what should have been secure location. The aftermath of Dumbledore's death was a devastating blow that affected entire magical community, while also creating leadership vacuum that would force students like herself to assume responsibilities that they were not yet prepared to handle. Understanding that the protection and guidance they had taken for granted was no longer available when they would need it most, during conflicts that would test every limit of their capabilities and moral conviction. Her grief over Dumbledore's loss was complicated by anger at herself for failing to prevent tragedy that better preparation or quicker thinking might have avoided, though rational analysis indicated that the forces arrayed against them had been too powerful and well coordinated for student defenders to overcome, regardless of their dedication or tactical skill. The guilt was irrational but persistent, affecting her assessment of her own capabilities and responsibilities. The decision to accompany Harry on his mission to hunt horcruxes was an inevitable consequence of everything she had learned about loyalty, friendship, and moral obligation. Understanding that abandoning him to face such dangers alone would be betrayal of principles that defined her character and values that had been shaped through years of shared struggle against forces that threatened everything they cared about most deeply. The research into Horcrux destruction that she conducted in preparation for their mission was most advanced magical theory she had ever attempted, requiring understanding of dark magic and soul manipulation that pushed boundaries of acceptable magical knowledge, while providing essential information that might mean difference between success and failure when they confronted objects that contained fragments of Voldemort's essence. The books that she requisitioned from Dumbledore's office represented unauthorized access to restricted magical knowledge that exceeded anything normally available to students. Information that was potentially dangerous but absolutely necessary for mission that would require capabilities that no standard magical education could provide. The research was both thrilling and terrifying, revealing magical possibilities that challenged every assumption about limits and ethical boundaries. The summer that followed was spent in intensive preparation that would determine whether their mission had any possibility of success. Understanding that they would be operating without adult guidance or institutional support, in situations where single mistake could prove fatal, not just for themselves but for everyone, depending on their success in locating and destroying objects that were essential to Voldemort's continued existence and growing power. The train journey home carried someone who had been transformed by combat experience and romantic awakening into a young woman whose understanding of herself and her relationships had been fundamentally altered by experiences that combined personal growth with growing awareness of responsibilities that would require everything she had learned about magic, friendship, and love in service of mission, that would test every limit of courage, intelligence, and moral conviction she possessed. Welcome to the year of ultimate sacrifice and desperate purpose, where the brightest witch of her age discovered that the most profound magic lay not in advanced spells or complex potions, but in the willingness to surrender everything she held dear in service of a cause that demanded prices no textbook could calculate or prepare her to pay. The decision that would define her 7th year was made before it officially began, a choice that required her to commit the most heartbreaking act of magic she would ever perform upon the 2 people who had loved her unconditionally since the moment of her birth. The memory modification that she performed on her parents was advanced magic that exceeded anything she had learned in 6 years of magical education, requiring not just technical precision but emotional strength that challenged every assumption she had developed about her own capacity for necessary cruelty, when circumstances demanded actions that violated every instinct of love and protection that had guided her relationship with the people who had given her life and shaped her character through unwavering support and encouragement. The spell work required to alter their memories so completely was among the most complex magic she had ever attempted, requiring weeks of careful preparation and research into techniques that were barely covered in advanced texts because of their potential for abuse and the devastating psychological consequences that could result from improperly executed mental manipulation. Each component had to be perfectly calibrated to create new identities that would be sustainable under scrutiny while erasing every trace of their daughter's existence from minds that had been shaped by 18 years of parental love and pride. The false memories she implanted were carefully constructed to provide them with fulfilling life story that would justify their relocation to Australia, while eliminating any emotional trauma that might result from subconscious awareness of loss they couldn't consciously remember. Wendell and Monica Wilkins would have complete history together that included shared dreams of Australian adventure, financial resources to support comfortable lifestyle, and professional credentials that would allow them to establish new dental practice in country whose magical government might provide better protection than British ministry, that was increasingly compromised by Death Eater infiltration. The emotional cost of watching her parents pack belongings for trip they believed was exciting adventure rather than protective exile was devastating in ways that no previous experience had prepared her to endure, understanding that she was witnessing final moments of relationship that had been most important foundation of her identity and moral development. The conversations that preceded their departure were torture of maintaining normal demeanor while knowing that she would never again see them as people who remembered creating, nurturing, and loving the daughter who had been source of such pride and joy throughout their marriage. The justification that sustained her through execution of plan that violated every principle of consent and autonomy that she had been raised to value was understanding that Voldemort's victory would mean their deaths in circumstances far more horrible than mere memory loss, that preserving their lives required sacrificing their knowledge of her existence, even when such sacrifice created emotional devastation that would affect every remaining day of her own life. Regardless of whether their mission succeeded or failed catastrophically, the practical preparations that followed were equally demanding, though less emotionally destructive, requiring magical skills that transformed her beaded bag into portable base of operations that could sustain 3 people indefinitely while remaining light enough to carry during extended travel through hostile territory where discovery would mean capture, torture, and death. The extension charm required for such expansion was advanced magic that pushed boundaries of space-time manipulation while maintaining structural integrity that could withstand rough treatment and constant use. The supplies that she packed represented months of research into survival techniques and magical theory that might prove essential when they found themselves operating without access to normal wizarding amenities like Diagon Alley, shopping, or Hogwarts library resources. Every book, potion ingredient, magical device, and mundane necessity had to be carefully selected for maximum utility while remaining within weight and space limitations that would allow rapid movement when circumstances required immediate departure from compromised locations. The camping equipment was enhanced with magical protections and comfort charms that would make extended outdoor living tolerable while maintaining concealment from both magical and muggle detection methods that enemies might employ to track their movements. The tent was expanded internally to provide adequate space for 3 people, while remaining externally inconspicuous enough to avoid attracting attention from authorities who might question presence of underage wizards traveling without adult supervision. The Seven Potters plan represented culmination of everything she had learned about tactical thinking and magical innovation, complex operation that required precise coordination between multiple participants while accounting for variables that could prove fatal if inadequately anticipated. Her role in plan was both crucial and terrifying, requiring her to transform into perfect duplicate of Harry Potter while trusting that protective measures would be adequate to ensure survival when facing enemies whose capabilities exceeded anything they had previously encountered. The polyjuice potion required for transformation was brewed to specifications that demanded absolute precision, understanding that any deviation from perfect formula could result in incomplete disguise that would immediately identify her as decoy rather than genuine target that Death Eaters were seeking to capture or kill. The taste was revolting, and the physical transformation was profoundly disorienting, changing not just her appearance, but her entire sensory experience of inhabiting different body with different proportions and capabilities. The flight with Kingsley Shacklebolt provided her first experience of aerial combat against enemies who were using lethal force without hesitation, battle that required every defensive technique she had learned, while also testing her ability to maintain disguise under extreme pressure, when discovery would mean immediate targeting by Voldemort himself, rather than ordinary Death Eaters, whose capabilities were merely formidable rather than overwhelmingly superior. The pursuit that followed their departure from Privet Drive was coordinated assault that demonstrated enemy intelligence capabilities that had identified their plan while failing to penetrate its essential deception, forcing Death Eaters to divide their attention between multiple targets while ensuring that real Harry Potter would have maximum protection during most dangerous phase of extraction from location that had provided sanctuary since infancy. The injuries that Kingsley sustained during their battle were serious enough to require immediate medical attention upon reaching Safe House, while her own minor wounds served as reminder of how quickly magical combat could turn fatal when participants were using spells designed to kill rather than merely incapacitate opponents who might be questioned or imprisoned, rather than eliminated as immediate threats to ongoing operations. The reunion at the Burrow was emotional relief that was immediately overshadowed by news of Mad-Eye Moody's death, loss that affected entire Order, while highlighting costs that resistance activities were exacting from people whose sacrifice enabled others to continue fighting against forces that seemed to possess every advantage except moral conviction and willingness to die for principles that transcended personal survival or individual achievement. The wedding of Bill and Fleur provided temporary respite from war preparations while also serving as gathering point for magical community leaders whose conversations revealed scope of challenges that extended far beyond immediate tactical concerns into questions about future of magical society and principles that would guide reconstruction efforts if resistance activities ultimately proved successful against enemies who controlled most official governmental and media institutions. Her encounter with Victor Krum during wedding celebration was bittersweet reminder of relationship that might have developed under different circumstances, conversation that highlighted roads not taken, while also confirming that her heart belonged completely to Ron, despite complications and misunderstandings that had characterized their romantic development throughout years of friendship and shared adventures that had created bonds deeper than mere attraction or social convenience. The Death Eater attack that interrupted celebration was coordinated assault that demonstrated enemy intelligence capabilities, while also providing opportunity to test escape procedures that would prove essential during coming months of life as fugitives from magical government that was increasingly controlled by forces committed to their capture and elimination. The disapparition that carried them to safety was executed under pressure that could have proved fatal if their preparation had been inadequate for emergency evacuation. The Ministry infiltration mission represented pinnacle of everything she had learned about magical disguise and infiltration techniques, requiring sustained impersonation of Mafalda Hopkirk while navigating governmental building filled with enemies who would immediately recognize their true identities if deception failed for even moment during operation that was essential for retrieving Horcrux that was being worn by someone whose authority made direct confrontation impossible. The polyjuice potion maintenance required constant attention to timing and dosage that could not be allowed to lapse during critical phases of mission. Understanding that reverting to true appearance while surrounded by Death Eaters and Ministry officials would mean immediate capture and probably torture, designed to extract information about Harry Potter's location and order activities that could compromise every remaining resistance operation. The Muggle-born Registration Commission tribunal that she was forced to observe was systematic persecution that revealed depths of evil that Voldemort's regime was implementing through official governmental channels, reducing people like herself to subhuman status that justified imprisonment, torture, and eventual elimination as contaminating influences that threatened purity of magical bloodlines that supremacist ideology claimed to protect. The violence that erupted during their escape from Ministry building was chaotic battle that required improvisation and desperate measures when their carefully planned operation encountered complications that threatened to leave them trapped in hostile territory surrounded by enemies who would show no mercy to captured resistance fighters. The stunning spells and other defensive magic that she employed were necessary for survival, but also marked her transition from student to active combatant in war, where ethical niceties were luxury that could prove fatal. The contamination of Grimmauld Place by Yaxley's presence during their escape meant loss of primary safe house and base of operations, forcing them into nomadic existence that would test every aspect of their preparation, while also isolating them from Order support network that had provided guidance and resources during previous adventures that had been dangerous but not completely independent operations. The camping that followed was education in survival techniques and psychological endurance that exceeded anything her academic preparation had anticipated. Months of constant movement and primitive living conditions. While searching for horcruxes, whose locations were matters of speculation, rather than confirmed intelligence that could guide systematic search efforts, The horcrux locket that they retrieved from Ministry created psychological contamination that affected all three participants, but was particularly devastating for Ron, whose emotional vulnerabilities were exploited by dark magic that amplified insecurity and jealousy into paranoid obsession that ultimately drove him away from friends who needed his support during most dangerous phase of their mission. The argument that preceded Ron's departure was culmination of tensions that had been building throughout months of hardship and disappointment, emotional breakdown that was encouraged by Horcrux influence, but rooted in genuine frustrations and fears that made his decision to abandon mission understandable, even when it was devastating for those he left behind to continue work that seemed increasingly hopeless without his contributions. Her reaction to Ron's departure was grief so profound that it challenged her ability to function normally, combination of romantic loss and friendship betrayal that was amplified by isolation and constant danger into depression that threatened to undermine her effectiveness when Harry needed her support more than ever before. The weeks that followed were marked by silence and tears that reflected depths of feeling that she had never previously acknowledged even to herself. The recovery from emotional devastation required conscious effort to redirect focus toward mission objectives and Harry's welfare, rather than dwelling on personal loss that could not be changed through analysis or magical intervention. Understanding that survival and success required suppression of feelings that were natural and valid, but also potentially fatal distractions. When facing enemies whose capabilities exceeded anything their preparation had anticipated, the research into Horcrux locations and destruction methods continued despite reduced capabilities and limited resources, requiring creative approaches to problems that seemed increasingly insoluble without additional information or assistance from sources that were no longer available to them. Each lead that proved false was a discouraging setback that tested their commitment to mission, whose success seemed less probable with each passing day of fruitless investigation. The journey to Godric's Hollow was emotional pilgrimage as well as tactical necessity, providing Harry with opportunity to visit parents' grave, while also pursuing theoretical possibility that Sword of Gryffindor might be hidden in location that held personal significance for him and historical importance for resistance against dark forces that had been gathering strength for generations before reaching current crisis point. The attack by Nagini in Bathilda Bagshot's house was coordinated ambush that demonstrated enemy surveillance capabilities, while also revealing how completely their movements were being monitored, despite precautions that should have provided adequate concealment from normal detection methods. The battle was a desperate struggle for survival that required every defensive technique they possessed, while also protecting Harry when he was unconscious and vulnerable to finishing attacks. The injury to Harry's wand during their escape was practical disaster that eliminated one of their most reliable defensive capabilities, while also creating symbolic loss that reflected broader pattern of equipment failure and resource depletion that was making their mission increasingly difficult to continue with any reasonable probability of success. Ron's return with sword and explanation of how he had located them was emotional reunion that was complicated by weeks of anger and hurt that could not be immediately resolved, despite relief at his survival and willingness to rejoin mission that had seemed hopeless without his participation. The forgiveness process was gradual and sometimes difficult, requiring conscious effort to rebuild trust that had been damaged by abandonment during crucial period when support had been desperately needed. The information about Deathly Hallows that they obtained from Xenophilius Lovegood provided dangerous distraction from Horcrux mission, while also revealing additional layer of magical theory and historical legend that complicated their understanding of objects and powers that were influencing current conflict. The knowledge was both fascinating and potentially counterproductive, offering alternative approaches that might prove more effective than current strategy or might represent fatal diversion from correct path. The betrayal by Xenophilius and subsequent capture at Malfoy Manor was culmination of everything she had feared about operating as fugitives without adequate intelligence or support. Situation that demonstrated how completely they were outmatched by enemies who possessed superior resources and information, while also revealing depth of evil that Voldemort's followers were willing to embrace in pursuit of objectives that transcended any recognizable moral framework. The torture that she endured from Bellatrix Lestrange was physical and psychological violation that exceeded anything her previous experiences had prepared her to survive. Prolonged application of Cruciatus Curse combined with knife work that carved slur into her arm as permanent reminder of hatred that motivated enemies whose malevolence was both personal and ideological. The experience was educational in ways that no academic instruction could provide, revealing depths of evil that existed within magical community. The rescue by Dobby was salvation that came at cost of House Elf's life, sacrifice that demonstrated loyalty and courage, that shamed wizards who had treated his kind as property rather than recognizing intelligence and moral conviction that exceeded that of many supposedly superior magical beings. His death was devastating loss that affected all survivors, while highlighting ongoing injustices that their mission was ultimately designed to address. The recovery at Shell Cottage provided necessary respite for physical and emotional healing, while also offering opportunity to plan final phase of mission with better information and clearer understanding of obstacles that remained between them and success that seemed achievable despite setbacks, and losses that had tested every limit of endurance and commitment. The Gringotts infiltration that followed was culmination of everything she had learned about magical disguise and high-stakes deception, requiring sustained impersonation of Bellatrix Lestrange while navigating Goblin Bank security that was designed to prevent exactly the kind of intrusion they were attempting. The psychological challenge of maintaining disguise as someone who had tortured her was additional burden that tested emotional stability while demanding perfect performance under extreme pressure. The dragon escape that concluded their bank robbery was chaotic but successful conclusion to operation that provided them with additional horcrux, while also creating spectacular diversion that would occupy enemy attention and resources during crucial period when they needed to remain undetected, while planning final assault on Voldemort's remaining defenses. The return to Hogwarts for final battle represented homecoming that was both joyful and tragic, reunion with place that had been educational sanctuary, during years of growth and discovery now transformed into battlefield where everything they had learned would be tested against enemies who were committed to destroying not just their lives but principles and institutions that had shaped their development into people capable of effective resistance against systematic evil. The destruction of horcruxes in Chamber of Secrets with basilisk fangs was practical application of knowledge that had been accumulated through years of research and direct experience, final phase of mission that had consumed their 7th year, while providing education that no conventional curriculum could have matched. The success of their efforts was validation that systematic approach and careful preparation could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable when faced with determination and resources that enemies had underestimated. The kiss with Ron amid battle chaos was culmination of romantic tension that had been building throughout years of friendship and shared danger, moment of emotional honesty that was both personal triumph and symbolic recognition that love could flourish, even in circumstances where death was immediate possibility and future was uncertain. Prospect that depended on outcomes of conflicts that were still being determined through violence, and sacrifice that would affect entire magical world. Welcome to the culmination of courage and the dawn of victory where the brightest witch of her age discovered that the most profound magic was not found in ancient spells or legendary artifacts, but in the bonds of friendship that could withstand every trial, the power of love that could overcome the darkest evil, and the strength that emerged when ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things in service of justice that transcended personal cost or individual survival. The return to Hogwarts carried weight that exceeded mere homecoming, representing convergence of every lesson learned and every relationship forged during years of magical education that had prepared them for this moment, when everything they valued would be tested against forces that sought to destroy not just their lives, but the principles that made those lives worth preserving. The castle that welcomed them back was simultaneously familiar sanctuary and transformed battlefield. Ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of learning and growth, now preparing to host final confrontation between light and darkness that would determine the future of magical civilization. The corridors that had once echoed with student laughter and professorial instruction now hummed with tension and preparation, as defenders gathered to face enemies whose victory would mean the end of everything that Hogwarts represented in Cope's terms of knowledge, tolerance, and hope for a better world built upon understanding rather than fear. The room of requirement that had served as meeting place for Dumbledore's army was transformed once again, this time providing access to ancient magic and hidden passages that would prove essential for mission that required movement through castle that was increasingly controlled by hostile forces. The room's ability to provide exactly what was needed made it perfect base of operations for activities that pushed boundaries of what should have been possible for students, operating without adult guidance in situation that demanded capabilities exceeding anything normal magical education typically provided. The journey to the Chamber of Secrets represented return to location that had been site of her second-year petrification, underground realm, where Basilisk had once terrorized Muggle-born students like herself, but now provided resources that would prove essential for completing mission that had consumed their 7th year. The descent through ancient pipes was both practical necessity and symbolic journey into depths of magical history where solutions to contemporary problems could be found through understanding of past conflicts and their resolution. Ron's ability to speak Parseltongue through mimicry of sounds he had heard from Harry was breakthrough that demonstrated how completely their partnership had evolved to encompass capabilities that none of them possessed. Individually, collaborative magic that exceeded the sum of individual contributions through synthesis that had been developing throughout years of shared adventures and mutual dependence. His success in opening the chamber was personal triumph that validated his essential contributions to their mission, despite insecurities that had sometimes made him question his own value. The basilisk fangs that they harvested were tools of destruction that could unmake dark magic through venom that was among the few substances capable of completely destroying horcruxes, practical application of knowledge that had been purchased through years of research and direct experience with creatures and artifacts that represented pinnacle of dangerous magical knowledge. Each fang was precious resource that would allow them to eliminate objects that contained fragments of Voldemort's soul. The destruction of Hufflepuff's cup was cathartic release of magical energy that had been contained within artifact for decades, visible proof that their systematic approach to Horcrux elimination was succeeding despite obstacles and setbacks that had tested every limit of determination and capability throughout months of desperate searching and dangerous infiltration. The cup's destruction was one step closer to making Voldemort mortal and vulnerable to final defeat. Her admiration for Ron's growth and competence was genuine recognition of how completely he had evolved from insecure boy into capable wizard whose contributions were essential rather than merely helpful, transformation that had been achieved through trials that tested character, while revealing strengths that had always existed but required extreme circumstances to fully manifest. The pride she felt in his achievement was both romantic and professional, appreciation for partner whose abilities complemented her own. The return to common areas of castle brought them face to face with other defenders who had answered call to protect Hogwarts from assault that would determine whether magical education and democratic values could survive against totalitarian forces that sought to impose ideological purity through violence and systematic oppression. The gathering represented unprecedented cooperation between different houses and age groups, united by shared commitment to principles that transcended individual interests. The Room of Requirement's transformation into armory and command center demonstrated its magical responsiveness to collective need rather than individual desire, providing weapons and tactical resources that would be essential for defending castle against enemies whose capabilities exceeded those of normal dark wizards through organization, resources, and absolute commitment to victory regardless of moral cost. The preparations revealed scope of battle that was approaching. The encounter with Draco Malfoy and his associates in Transformed Room was confrontation that brought together years of house rivalry and ideological conflict into life or death struggle, where past antagonisms became irrelevant compared to immediate survival needs. The battle that erupted was desperate fight against fiendfire that threatened to consume everyone regardless of their previous loyalties or current allegiances, forcing cooperation between former enemies when faced with magical fire that recognized no distinction between friend and foe. The fiendfire that Vincent Crabbe unleashed was dark magic that exceeded his ability to control, demonstration of how dangerous incomplete knowledge could become when combined with malicious intent and desperate circumstances that drove people to attempt spells whose power exceeded their understanding or capability. The magical flames were alive with malevolent intelligence that sought to consume everything within their reach regardless of casters' original intentions. Her quick thinking and magical skill in coordinating their escape from room that had become death trap demonstrated capabilities that had been developed through years of practical experience with dangerous situations. Leadership that emerged naturally when circumstances demanded immediate action from someone who understood both magical theory and tactical realities of combat against forces that could prove instantly fatal if inadequately countered. The brooms that carried them to safety were tools perfectly suited to escape that required speed and maneuverability. The salvation of Draco and Goyle, despite years of antagonism and current opposition, was moral choice that reflected principles that transcended personal animosity and political disagreement. Understanding that preservation of human life took precedence over settling scores or allowing enemies to face consequences that they might deserve, but which she was not willing to allow when she possessed power to prevent tragedy. The rescue was both tactical necessity and ethical imperative. Ron's recognition that house elves deserved protection and evacuation from battle zone was emotional breakthrough that demonstrated how completely his worldview had evolved through exposure to her advocacy and direct experience with magical beings whose intelligence and loyalty had been proven through years of service that exceeded legal requirements. His suggestion that they coordinate elf evacuation was validation of everything she had worked to achieve through SPW activities. The kiss that followed his demonstration of moral growth was culmination of romantic tension that had been building throughout years of friendship and shared danger. A moment of emotional honesty that occurred amid chaos of battle when death was immediate possibility and future was uncertain prospect that might never arrive if they failed to survive current crisis. The passion of their embrace lifted her physically from ground while emotionally elevating both participants beyond previous understanding of their relationship. The interruption of their romantic moment by urgent tactical necessity was a reminder that personal happiness had to be balanced against collective survival needs when engaging in warfare that would determine fate of everyone they cared about. But the kiss had established foundation for future relationship that would provide strength and motivation for continued resistance against forces that threatened to destroy everything that made their love possible and meaningful. The battle that raged throughout Castle was unlike anything in magical history. Coordinated assault by professional Death Eaters against defenders who ranged from experienced adults to students whose only qualification was moral conviction and willingness to risk everything for principles that they understood intellectually, but had never been tested to defend with their lives. The scope of conflict challenged every assumption about nature of magical combat and scale of violence that civilized society should tolerate. The corridors that had once been safe passages for students moving between classes became battlefields where lethal spells flew in both directions, while ancient protections struggled to maintain structural integrity against magical forces that had never been anticipated by original builders who designed Castle for education rather than warfare. The damage accumulated with each exchange of curses that were designed to kill rather than merely incapacitate opponents who might be questioned or imprisoned. Her participation in battle alongside Luna and Ginny against Bellatrix Lestrange was confrontation with enemy who had tortured her at Malfoy Manor, personal vendetta that was also tactical necessity when facing Death Eater, whose capabilities and ruthlessness made her immediate threat to everyone in surrounding area. The battle was coordinated effort that required precise timing and mutual trust between participants who had trained together but never faced opponent of Bellatrix's experience and malevolence. The intervention by Molly Weasley that concluded Bellatrix's threat was demonstration of maternal fury transformed into lethal magical force, protecting younger fighters, while also avenging losses and suffering that Death Eaters had inflicted on family members and friends whose deaths demanded justice that legal system could never provide when dealing with enemies who acknowledged no law except power and showed no mercy to defeated opponents. The apparent death of Harry Potter was a devastating blow that threatened to shatter morale and resistance when Voldemort displayed what appeared to be ultimate proof of his victory over prophecy and magical protection that had sustained hope throughout years of struggle against seemingly impossible odds. The grief that overwhelmed defenders was both personal loss and symbolic defeat that seemed to validate enemy claims about inevitability of their triumph over light and justice. Her reaction to seeing Harry's apparently lifeless body was a combination of personal devastation and tactical despair, understanding that his death would mean not only loss of dear friend, but elimination of magical protection and prophetic destiny that had provided foundation for resistance activities throughout war against forces that possessed superior resources and organization. The tears that she shed were for individual tragedy and collective catastrophe that seemed to make continued resistance pointless. Neville Longbottom's defiance of Voldemort and destruction of Nagini was a heroic act that demonstrated how ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when motivated by principles that transcended personal safety and individual survival. Magical combat that eliminated final Horcrux, while also providing inspiration for renewed resistance against enemies who had seemed invincible until someone with sufficient courage proved that they were merely powerful rather than truly unstoppable. The revelation that Harry had survived, and his final confrontation with Voldemort, was vindication of everything they had fought for throughout years of struggle against dark forces. Demonstration that love and sacrifice could overcome hatred and selfishness when sustained by determination that refused to accept defeat even when victory seemed impossible according to conventional military analysis. The destruction of Voldemort was liberation for an entire magical world. The immediate aftermath of victory was mixture of relief, grief, and exhaustion that reflected psychological toll of warfare that had tested every limit of human endurance, while demanding sacrifices that would affect survivors for the remainder of their lives. The dead included friends and enemies whose absence would reshape magical society in ways that could only be determined through years of rebuilding and reconciliation that would require different kinds of courage than combat had demanded. Fred Weasley's death was personal tragedy that affected entire extended family, while also representing broader costs that victory had required from people who had committed everything to struggle against tyranny, understanding that freedom had been purchased through blood of those who would never live to enjoy peace that their sacrifice had made possible. The grief was both individual loss and collective acknowledgement of prices that had been paid. The Great Hall that had once hosted house competitions and academic ceremonies was transformed into memorial space where bodies of fallen defenders were laid with dignity befitting their sacrifice. Physical reminder of costs that victory had required, while also providing location for community processing of trauma and loss that would require healing efforts extending far beyond immediate medical attention to wounds that were physical, rather than psychological. Her participation in ministering to wounded and grieving demonstrated how completely her worldview had evolved beyond academic achievement to encompass service and compassion that were essential for rebuilding magical society, according to Dumbledore, principles that had motivated resistance against forces, seeking to impose hierarchy based on blood status rather than merit and character. The work was both practical necessity and moral obligation that reflected values she had developed throughout magical education. The recognition that their mission had succeeded despite losses and setbacks was validation of systematic approach and collaborative effort that had overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable when faced with determination and resources that enemies had consistently underestimated. The Horcrux destruction had made Voldemort's defeat possible, while their friendship had provided strength necessary to sustain effort throughout months of hardship and disappointment. The weeks that followed victory were devoted to recovery and planning for future that none of them had been certain they would live to see. Understanding that peace would require different kinds of effort and commitment than war had demanded, but would be no less challenging in terms of personal growth and social responsibility. The magical world needed rebuilding that would address underlying causes of conflict rather than merely celebrating elimination of particular enemy leader. The journey to Australia to restore her parents' memories was emotional reunion that was complicated by years of separation and fundamental changes in her character that had been wrought through experiences that they could never fully understand or share. Gap between magical and muggle perspectives that had widened during war years when survival had required capabilities and knowledge that normal parental guidance could never have provided. The memory restoration was delicate magical work that required reversing complex spells while ensuring that psychological integration would be successful rather than traumatic. Understanding that her parents had lived as different people for extended period and forced return to previous identities might create confusion and distress that could damage relationships she was desperate to repair after years of necessary separation and deception. The reunion with Wendell and Monica Wilkins, who gradually remembered being Mr. and Mrs. Granger, was joyful conclusion to sacrifice that had been among most painful decisions she had ever made. Validation that protection of those she loved could be achieved through methods that preserved their lives, even when requiring temporary loss of relationships that had been most important foundations of her identity and moral development. The return to England with restored family represented completion of circle that had been broken by war's demands, though understanding that their relationship would necessarily be different given experiences she had undergone and maturity she had achieved through trials that had transformed her from exceptional student into war hero whose capabilities exceeded those of many adult wizards who had received conventional magical education without testing under extreme circumstances. The decision to complete her 7th year at Hogwarts, despite everything she had learned and accomplished, was commitment to formal education that reflected understanding that institutional credentials would be necessary for career advancement, while also providing opportunity to process trauma and transition back to civilian life after months of survival-focused existence where academic achievement had been secondary to immediate survival needs. The return to classroom instruction was both comforting routine and strange adjustment after years spent in life-or-death situations where theoretical knowledge had been constantly tested through practical application. Understanding that normal academic work would seem trivial compared to challenges she had overcome, but recognizing that systematic completion of magical education would provide foundation for future contributions to magical society that she was determined to serve. Her marriage to Ron was natural culmination of relationship that had been developing throughout years of friendship and shared danger, partnership based on complementary abilities and mutual respect that had been tested through circumstances that would have destroyed less solid foundations. The wedding represented not just personal happiness, but symbolic union between different approaches to problem solving that had proven mutually enhancing when combined through collaborative effort. The children who followed represented next generation that would benefit from world that had been preserved through their parents' sacrifice and struggle. Rose and Hugo Granger Weasley growing up in magical society that offered opportunities and protections that had been threatened during war years but were now secured through vigilance and commitment to principles that transcended individual advancement or personal convenience. The career at Ministry of Magic in Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures was natural extension of advocacy work that had begun during 4th year with founding of SPW, professional application of principles and knowledge that had been developed through years of study and direct experience with injustices that required systematic reform rather than individual charity or temporary assistance that failed to address underlying causes of systematic oppression. The work with house elves and other magical creatures required policy development and legal reform that drew upon everything she had learned about research, analysis, and persuasion during years of academic study and practical application. Understanding that lasting change required institutional modification rather than mere attitudinal adjustment among individuals who might support reform in principle but lack systematic approaches to implementation and enforcement. The progression through ministry hierarchy to position of Minister for Magic represented recognition of capabilities and achievements that exceeded those of colleagues who had received conventional preparation for public service, careers, demonstration that exceptional dedication and comprehensive understanding of magical society's challenges could compensate for lack of traditional political experience when combined with moral conviction and systematic approach to complex problems. The legislation that she sponsored and implemented addressed underlying causes of magical creature discrimination, while also reforming educational policies that had failed to prepare students for realities of magical world, where different species and cultures required mutual understanding and cooperation rather than hierarchical domination based on traditional prejudices that had contributed to conflicts like recent war against Voldemort's supremacist ideology. The chocolate frog card that featured her image and achievements was recognition that her contributions to magical society had earned place among historical figures whose work had influenced development of magical civilization, validation that academic excellence, combined with moral courage and practical application, could create legacy that would inspire future generations of magical practitioners who would face their own challenges and opportunities. The friendships that she maintained with Harry, Ron, and extended Weasley family provided continuing foundation for personal happiness and professional effectiveness, relationships that had been forged through shared struggle and tested through extreme circumstances remaining strong, despite changes in responsibilities and social positions that might have created distance between people whose bonds were based on less solid foundations than mutual sacrifice and proven loyalty. The godmother role that she accepted for James Potter represented continuing connection to next generation, while also acknowledging responsibility for passing on values and knowledge that had been essential for previous victory against dark forces, understanding that vigilance and education would be necessary to prevent recurrence of conflicts that had cost so much in terms of lives and social disruption, that peaceful resolution required active maintenance rather than passive assumption. The legacy that she created through career and family was demonstration that academic achievement could be channeled towards service that benefited entire magical community rather than merely individual advancement. Proof that exceptional abilities carried obligations to use those capabilities for purposes that transcended personal success or social recognition to encompass systematic improvement in conditions that affected everyone who shared magical world that had been preserved through sacrifice and dedication. The world that emerged from war was imperfect but improving. Magical society that had learned through bitter experience that equality and justice required active maintenance rather than passive assumption. Institutions that had been reformed through hard-won understanding that diversity and tolerance were not luxuries that could be abandoned during difficult periods, but essential foundations for civilization that could withstand challenges and emerge stronger rather than merely different. The brightest witch of her age had become something more valuable than exceptional student or brilliant researcher, evolving into leader whose contributions would influence magical society for generations, while providing example of how individual dedication could create changes that seemed impossible until someone possessed sufficient determination to transform theoretical understanding into practical reality through systematic effort and unwavering commitment to principles that made struggle worthwhile, regardless of personal cost or individual recognition. Rest now, dear dreamer, as our tale of Hermione Granger finds its peaceful conclusion. In the quiet wisdom of this magical hour, let yourself be comforted by the memory of a girl who proved that brilliance paired with compassion can change the world. Her bushy hair may have been tamed, and her fierce debates may have settled into thoughtful discourse, but the spirit of curiosity and justice that defined her burns eternal in every student who follows her example. As you drift toward dreams, remember that true magic isn't found only in wands and spells, but in the courage to stand up for what's right, the wisdom to never stop learning, and the love that binds us to those who matter most. Hermione's greatest enchantments weren't the complex spells she mastered, but her unwavering loyalty to friends, her dedication to the oppressed, and her proof that knowledge combined with heart can overcome the darkest of times. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the magical world, bright young minds are opening books by candlelight, following the path she blazed from the Muggle world to the very heart of magical greatness. Sweet dreams, and remember, The very best of magic lives in those brave enough to use their gifts in service of others, just as Hermione did throughout her extraordinary life.